Picture this. It's 69 AD, and Rome is basically a giant soap opera, but with more swords and fewer clothes. In just 1 year, the empire burns through 4 emperors faster than you burn through your New Year's resolutions. There's betrayal, civil war, bribery and egos, so big they could crush the Colosseum. Welcome to the Roman Game of Thrones, where the only thing more dangerous than being emperor is wanting to be emperor. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Nero, Rome's final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and the man who proved that yes, it is possible to be so bad at your job that people prefer civil war over letting you keep it. By the time 68 AD rolled around, Nero was like the boss who stopped coming into the office, spends company funds on personal pet projects, and expects everyone to praise his vision while the building's literally on fire. Let's take a look at the final act of this walking disaster piece. Nero fancied himself quite the Renaissance man. If the Renaissance had happened 1,500 years early, and was mostly about bad poetry and worse singing, while Rome teetered on the brink of collapse, Nero was more interested in perfecting his lyre performances and starring in his own plays. Imagine the CEO of a crumbling company pausing a shareholder meeting to show off his new guitar solo. That was Nero. Except instead of polite applause, the audience was mostly senators plotting how to replace him without getting stabbed first. To say he was paranoid would be an understatement. Nero was convinced that just about everyone was out to get him, which, to be fair, was absolutely true by the end. He'd executed his mother after multiple failed attempts, including collapsing her ceiling and trying to sink her boat, his first wife, his second wife, and half of Rome's aristocracy just to be safe. When he wasn't killing off relatives and allies, he was holding singing competitions where nobody was allowed to leave until he was done. A fate worse than death? Quite possibly. Let's not forget the Great Fire of Rome, 64 AD, the blaze that ate up most of the city while, legend has it, Nero played his lyre and composed songs about the destruction. Did he really fiddle while Rome burned? Probably not. But when your PR is that bad, the story sticks. And Nero's PR was on life support. The fire was seen by many as proof that Nero wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerously self-absorbed. When he started building his massive pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, right on top of the burned-out remains of people's homes, the message was loud and clear. Nero cares more about his personal theme park than the empire. Even his once loyal generals started looking at each other and whispering, "We can do better than this, right?" In 68 AD, after revolts erupted in the provinces, and the Senate finally grew a spine, Nero did the one thing he'd never done before. He ran. With the Imperial palace no longer safe, Nero fled Rome, accompanied by a small band of loyalists, who probably regretted their life choices every step of the way. Eventually, cornered and abandoned, Nero took his own life, his supposed last words. "What an artist dies in me." Truly the man knew how to make everything about himself, even in death. Historians have debated whether he actually said that, or if later chroniclers just couldn't resist adding one more layer of theatrical nonsense to his story. Nero's death left Rome in a state of total confusion. There was no clear heir, no son, no nephew, no plan, just a giant imperial chair suddenly empty, and everyone in the room staring at it like it was cursed. The Senate, the generals, the Praetorian Guard, they all knew somebody had to sit in it. But who? And could they do it without triggering a bloodbath? The senators, who'd spent years nodding along to Nero's bad decisions, now found themselves in the unenviable position of picking up the pieces. The generals in the provinces, meanwhile, saw opportunity. The empire was up for grabs, and all it would cost was a few thousand lives, some strategic bribes, and maybe promising to share the loot with their soldiers, promises they'd immediately regret. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how bad this situation really was. Nero's reign had drained the treasury, weakened the army's discipline, and set province against province. The empire was in modern terms like a company whose CEO just quit mid-scandal, with no successor, no cash, and employees on the verge of mutiny. And now everyone wanted the top job. No matter how high the body count would have to climb, Rome wanted a new emperor. What it got was an ancient version of a bad Tinder match. Swipe after swipe, none of them worked out. Each candidate seemed promising at first, experienced, noble, respected, and then they actually got the job. Within months, sometimes weeks, Rome was left wondering how things could possibly get worse. Spoiler, they always could. And so, with Nero gone and no plan in place, the blood-soaked game of musical thrones began. 4 men would wear the imperial purple in quick succession, each hoping they could hold on to power just long enough to secure their legacy, or at least avoid getting stabbed in the back. Coming up next, Galba, the grumpy grandpa emperor, who proved that being first in line isn't always a good thing. If Nero's fall left Rome with an empty throne and no plan, Galba's rise was like filling that throne with the first grandpa who wandered into the room. At 70 years old, ancient by Roman standards, Galba was a man with a long, mostly respectable military career. He'd served in Gaul, Germany, Africa, and Spain, and had earned a reputation for discipline, frugality, and general grumpiness. Basically, he was the kind of guy you'd want managing your budget, but maybe not leading an empire in crisis. So how did Galba go from provincial governor to emperor of the Roman world? Simple. Nero imploded, and Galba was in the right place, with the right army, at the right time. His troops in Spain declared him emperor even before Nero officially bit the dust, and thanks to alliances with other disillusioned generals, he suddenly found himself marching toward Rome like a retiree who stumbled into a gladiator match, confused, cranky, but somehow still winning. The people of Rome, exhausted by Nero's circus of a reign, initially welcomed Galba like a breath of fresh air. Finally, here was a no-nonsense general, a man who wouldn't waste their taxes on palaces, pageants, or bad poetry readings, someone who would bring stability, order, sanity, yeah, about that. Galba entered the city, took one look around at the mess Nero left behind, and immediately did what he was famous for. He tightened the purse strings. This wasn't a ruler who tried to win people over with generosity or grand gestures. Galba's first move was to cancel bonuses promised to the Praetorian Guard. You know, the heavily armed guys who'd helped him seize power in the first place. That's like stiffing your moving crew after they've hauled your couch up 6 flights of stairs. And it wasn't just the Praetorian Guard. Galba cut spending everywhere. He revoked pensions. He clawed back land grants. He refused to pay out Nero's bribes. To him, this was responsible governance. To everyone else, it was like inviting people to a party and then locking up the wine, turning off the music, and passing around a bill for the snacks they'd already eaten. Hence the perfect modern summary. Galba was the guy who shows up at the party and immediately turns off the music, takes away the wine, and tells everyone they owe him money. In a city that had grown used to emperors buying loyalty with handouts and games, Galba's austerity felt like an insult. His stinginess didn't just offend, it actively endangered him. The soldiers felt cheated, the senators felt ignored, the people felt abandoned, and Galba, in his mind, was probably thinking, what's wrong with these ungrateful brats? I'm saving the empire. If you're going to rule with iron discipline, it helps to have clever advisors. Unfortunately, Galba surrounded himself with what Roman historians politely described as unpopular favorites. Translation: greedy yes-men who made enemies faster than Galba could pinch a denarius. Chief among these was Titus Vinius, whose reputation for corruption was so legendary that people openly joked about his willingness to sell imperial favors for the right price. Then there was Isolus, a freedman who acted like he owned the empire, and Cornelius Laco, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, whose laziness became a running gag. Imagine your head of security treating actual conspiracies like annoying paperwork he'll get to eventually. These cronies enriched themselves while Galba preached discipline, creating the perfect recipe for resentment. The emperor, who was supposed to clean up Nero's mess, had accidentally created a brand new one. Galba's final act of political genius. When he realized he needed to secure his position, he chose an heir. Sensible, except he picked Piso Licinianos, a man widely respected for his integrity and moral character. Sounds good on paper, right? The catch? He didn't choose Otho, the guy who had bankrolled Galba's rise, expected to be named successor, and was already quietly measuring the curtains for the imperial palace. Otho was furious. The Praetorian Guard, still salty about their missing bonuses, was furious. The common people, seeing no bread, circuses, or hope of easier taxes, were furious. At this point, Galba was like a boss, who not only cancels bonuses, but also gives the promotion to the guy nobody even knew was applying. In just 7 months, Galba went from savior of Rome to walking dead man. His attempts at frugality, discipline, and moral restoration backfired spectacularly in a city that no longer wanted those things, at least not from him. The writing was on the wall, probably in red paint, with "pay up" scrawled beneath it. When Otho made his move, Galba had few friends left. The Praetorian Guard switched sides faster than you can say, "Where's my bonus?" And just like that, Galba's brief and miserable reign ended in blood, not in the glory of reform, but in the gutter of betrayal. Next up, Otho, the party boy, who thought he could fix Galba's mess, and learned the hard way that Rome wasn't done chewing up emperors. Otho is proof that in Rome sometimes the guy who looks like he should be managing a wine bar ends up running an empire, at least for a little while. If Galba was the grumpy grandpa who killed the vibe, Otho was the flashy guest who tried to restart the party, only to realize the building was already on fire. Let's set the scene. Otho had been tight with Nero back in the day. They shared a taste for lavish living, questionable decisions, and hairstyles that would make modern rock stars jealous. But their bromance fell apart when Nero stole Otho's wife, Poppaea Sabina, and exiled him to govern Spain. Otho never forgot the insult. Fast forward to 69 AD, and now Galba, the grumpy killjoy, had snubbed Otho again by choosing a different heir. That was all the motivation Otho needed. Otho's rise to power was textbook opportunism. Quick, ruthless, and surprisingly efficient. While Galba strutted around Rome, blissfully unaware that his own guards hated him more than unpaid interns. Hate their boss, Otho was working the back channels. He promised the Praetorian Guard exactly what they wanted: gold, bonuses, respect, and probably better snacks in the break room. The same soldiers who had sworn loyalty to Galba hours earlier now eagerly sharpened their daggers for his downfall. On January 15th, 69 AD, Otho's moment came. Galba was murdered in the Forum, his severed head paraded around like a party favor no one wanted. And just like that, Otho was emperor. No grand ceremony, no divine omens, just pure Roman-style office politics, with a lot more stabbing. Here's where Otho gets complicated. You'd think someone who just orchestrated a coup would pop open the amphore and celebrate. But Otho, oddly enough, mourned Galba. Well, kinda. He insisted on a decent burial for the man he'd just helped murder, publicly shed a few tears, and made the sort of heartfelt speeches that sound suspiciously rehearsed. Was it guilt, a clever PR move, or just Otho trying to look noble while standing ankle-deep in Galba's blood? The historians aren't sure. It's as if Otho had two gears, sentimental poet and cold-blooded operator. One minute he was handing out cash to soldiers like a drunken uncle at a wedding. The next he was gazing solemnly at Galba's body, murmuring about duty and honor. If Galba's reign was defined by tight fists and hard discipline, Otho's was a frantic scramble to buy friends and hold the empire together with whatever tools he could find. Picture a man trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape and good vibes. That was Otho's style of government. He restored old privileges, paid the Praetorian Guard handsomely, and threw money at anyone who might help him keep the peace. Senators, soldiers, citizens, everyone got a little taste of Otho's emergency generosity. But there was one small problem. The Imperial treasury was emptier than Nero's promises. Otho's spending spree was funded on hope and desperation, not actual gold. And as if Rome wasn't messy enough, there was a new threat on the horizon. Vitellius, this portly, gluttonous general in Germany, had also been declared emperor by his legions, and they were already marching toward Italy, ready to stake their claim. Suddenly, Otho's "let's all just get along" strategy looked about as effective as trying to stop a charging elephant with a polite request. Otho wasn't a fool. He knew Vitellius's army was coming, and he knew civil war was inevitable. But instead of holding up and hoping for the best, he tried to act decisively. He rallied his forces, prepared defenses, and even attempted diplomacy, offering to share power or negotiate peace. Spoiler: Vitellius was not interested. Sharing was not his thing. What's fascinating is that Otho genuinely seemed to want to avoid more bloodshed. He had won his crown through betrayal, yes, But now that he had it, he seemed determined not to let Rome fall deeper into chaos. He gave stirring speeches about duty, sacrifice, and unity, all while knowing his position was about as stable as a sandcastle at high tide. In April 69 AD, Otho's forces clashed with Vitellius's army at the Battle of Bedriacum. Otho's men fought hard, but the numbers and experience of Vitellius's German legions proved too much. When news of the defeat reached Otho, he faced a choice: flee, regroup, and continue the war, or end the bloodshed himself. In a move that shocked everyone, Otho chose the latter. He gave one final speech about saving Rome from further disaster, then took his own life, just 3 months into his reign. The party boy who seized power with bribes and promises went out not with a whimper, but with a strangely noble bang. Otho's reign was brief, chaotic, and ultimately doomed. But for a moment, he tried to steer the ship through the storm with everything he had: gold, charm, and a desperate hope that he could keep Rome together. It didn't work, but at least he went down trying. Alright, buckle up, because Vitellius is where the year of the 4 emperors goes crazy. If the Roman Empire needed a steady hand at the wheel after Otho's noble exit, what it got instead was Vitellius, a man who treated ruling like it was his personal ticket to a never-ending feast. Imagine if you gave supreme power to your fun uncle, who just wanted to barbecue, nap, and avoid responsibility. That was Vitellius, except with more banquets and a lot more debt. Vitellius wasn't exactly gunning for the throne when this wild year kicked off. A career politician and general of, let's say, modest talents, Vitellius was the kind of guy the Roman elite would invite to parties but never trust to organize them. But then, plot twist, the legions in Germania declared him emperor. Why? Because he was easygoing, generous with bribes, and didn't bother enforcing discipline. The troops adored him because he let them do what they wanted, which included drinking, gambling, and looting. So while Otho was still in Rome trying to patch up the empire, Vitellius was strapping on the imperial purple in the German camps, probably with gravy stains already on the fabric. His men marched on Italy, and after Otho's defeat at Bedriacum, Vitellius claimed the throne. To the victor go the spoils, and in Vitellius's case, that meant all the spoils. Vitellius didn't see the empire as a burden or sacred trust. He saw it as an all-you-can-eat buffet, and by Jupiter, he intended to get his money's worth. The man's feasts were the stuff of legend. Historians describe meals where he'd serve thousands of pounds of exotic fish, birds, and beasts, all washed down with wine that flowed like the Tiber after a flood. He invented dishes that were basically animal kingdom mashups: peacock brains, flamingo tongues, moray eel livers, the kind of things that would get you banned from modern food festivals. Vitellius treated ruling Rome like an all-you-can-eat buffet, and he planned to get his money's worth. He even had a dish named after himself, the Shield of Minerva, which wasn't a weapon but a monstrous stew of every expensive delicacy his cooks could cram into a single cauldron. Of course, someone has to pay for these feasts, and Vitellius's treasury was already as empty as his promises. To fund his gluttony, he seized estates, looted temples, and bled Rome's wealthiest citizens dry through trumped-up charges and fines. If you had a villa, Vitellius probably had his eye on it. If you had silver tableware, you could bet it'd end up at one of his banquets. What made this worse was Vitellius's absolute obliviousness to the crumbling empire around him. The provinces were restless, the treasury was bankrupt, and another challenger, spoiler, Vespasian, was rising in the east. But Vitellius, he was busy ordering another round of oysters. While Rome metaphorically, and occasionally literally, burned, Vitellius was debating whether honey-glazed dormice paired better with red or white wine. The Roman people, initially hopeful that Vitellius would stabilize things after Otho's reign, soon realized they'd swapped desperation for gluttony. Vitellius made a point of honoring the common people with public feasts and games, but even these events felt more like self-indulgence than generosity. He'd host parades where he showed off spoils of war he hadn't won, and lavished honors on friends who didn't deserve them. Behind the scenes, corruption ran rampant. His inner circle, mostly drinking buddies and flatterers, used their positions to enrich themselves. The Senate, cowed and humiliated, watched helplessly as Vitellius turned the empire into his personal banqueting hall. His focus was always the next meal, not the next policy. All this indulgence couldn't hide the storm gathering beyond Rome's walls. Vitellius's neglect of the provinces gave Vespasian, a tough, no-nonsense general in the east, the perfect opening. Vespasian's forces began their march toward Italy, while Vitellius was still wiping sauce from his chin. Even as Vespasian's legions closed in, Vitellius tried to ignore reality. He'd make vague offers of abdication, then immediately host another feast as if he could eat the problem away. His supporters abandoned him one by one, and eventually, the people of Rome, sick of the debt, the taxes, and the endless feasts they couldn't attend, turned on him too. By December 69 AD, Vitellius was emperor in name only. When Vespasian's troops entered Rome, Vitellius tried hiding, first in the palace, then in a servant's quarters. He was dragged out, paraded through the streets in humiliation, and killed on the Gemonian stairs, the same steps where so many of his victims had fallen before him. In the end, Vitellius didn't just feast himself into debt. He feasted himself out of power, out of allies, and out of time. If you thought having 4 emperors in 1 year was messy, wait until you see what happens when Rome's legions realize they can play kingmaker and get rich in the process. The year of the 4 emperors wasn't just about political intrigue. It was about tens of thousands of heavily armed, very cranky soldiers, marching all over the empire, smashing stuff, burning towns, and occasionally remembering they were supposed to be fighting for someone. Picture this. The Roman world in 69 AD looked like one giant office, where the employees, the legions, had all just fired their managers, the emperors, and started promoting whoever promised the biggest holiday bonus. Loyalty, honor, duty, forget that. What really mattered was, who's going to pay me, feed me, and maybe give me a fancy villa when this is all over? In Spain and Gaul, legions backed Galba, at least at first, until his refusal to bribe anyone made him about as popular as a tax collector at a festival. In Germany, Vitellius's soldiers cheered for him because he let them party, loot, and skip drills. Over in the east, Vespasian's legions saw a golden opportunity. While everyone else was busy tearing Italy apart, they could march in and clean up, then own the place. Rome's legions weren't fighting for honor. They were fighting because someone promised them a bonus and a new pair of sandals. The Civil War wasn't just politics. It was brutal, bloody, and downright disastrous for anyone caught in the middle. The most infamous showdown came at the First Battle of Bedriacum. Vitellius's forces, pumped full of wine, promises of plunder, and possibly leftover peacock tongues, clashed with Otho's troops. It was a disaster for Otho. His men fought bravely, but Vitellius's German legions were fresher, fiercer, and in no mood to lose the bonuses they'd been promised. After Otho's defeat, and his tragic exit from the stage, Vitellius strutted into Rome, but his victory party was short-lived. The Eastern legions, loyal to Vespasian, weren't about to let a man who governed by goblet stay in charge. They marched west, joined by angry, ambitious governors and commanders who saw Vitellius for what he was, an overfed liability. The Second Battle of Bedriacum sealed Vitellius's fate. This time, it was his turn to watch his army get smashed, his banners trampled, and his future shrink faster than a tunic in the wash. What about the poor civilians? Well, let's just say this wasn't a great time to own a farm, run a shop, or, frankly, be alive anywhere near the fighting. The legions on both sides treated the Italian countryside like a giant piñata, smashing homes, raiding food stores, torching villages, and generally acting like unpaid demolition crews who'd just been told they could keep whatever they broke. Roman farmers and townsfolk watched helplessly as their fields were trampled, their animals stolen, and their grain hauled off to feed whichever army came through next. There was no such thing as a safe side. 1 week you'd be forced to host Vitellius's goons, the next, Vespasian's. Either way, your wine cellar was empty by morning. And let's not forget the smaller battles and skirmishes that flared up like brush fires across the empire. Cities were besieged, bridges were burned, temples were looted, the economy nosedived, and the average Roman citizen just wanted to know, when will these maniacs stop wrecking everything? What makes this chapter of Roman history so fascinating is just how fast loyalties flipped. A legion might swear undying devotion to one emperor at dawn, only to declare for his rival by lunchtime, especially if the rival had deeper pockets or better cooks. Generals schemed, centurions bartered their men's swords, and whole armies would abandon a losing side to avoid ending up as corpses in a ditch. Even the Senate tried to keep up appearances, voting honors and titles for whoever seemed most likely to win at any given moment. One day, they'd hail Vitellius as the savior of Rome. A few weeks later, they'd be carving Vespasian's name into the same statues. Back in Rome itself, the mood was pure tension. The city was packed with nervous citizens, deserters, spies, and generals' messengers, all spreading rumors faster than a tavern bard. Every alley could be hiding an assassin. Every feast could turn into a conspiracy. Every temple was watched by soldiers eager to strip it of anything shiny. When Vespasian's army finally marched on Rome, it wasn't just about taking the city, it was about ending a year of chaos that had left the empire's heart exhausted, battered, and broke. In the end, the civil war didn't just decide who wore the purple, it reminded everyone, from senators to slaves, that Rome's real power lay with the legions. Whoever controlled them, controlled the world. And in 69 AD, those legions had turned the empire into their playground, their battleground, and unfortunately for Rome, their piggy bank. While the other emperors of 69 AD were busy stabbing, bribing, and feasting their way through the throne room, Vespasian was thousands of miles away, in the dusty chaos of Judea, watching it all unfold like a dad at a family reunion gone wrong. Vespasian's story isn't just about seizing power, it's about how to win without breaking a sweat, while everyone else is busy breaking Rome. Vespasian was stationed in the east, officially tasked with crushing the Jewish revolt, a brutal conflict that had already dragged on for years. But Vespasian wasn't just thinking about Jerusalem. His sharp military mind was tuned into the bigger picture, as reports trickled in about Nero's death, Galba's stinginess, Otho's desperate scrambles, and Vitellius's feasting. Vespasian saw what they didn't. Rome was up for grabs. Vespasian watched the other emperors fight it out like kids arguing over a toy, then calmly walked over and picked up the pieces. Unlike his rivals, Vespasian didn't rush. He didn't declare himself emperor the moment Nero died, or the instant Galba stumbled. No, Vespasian played it cool. He focused on building strength quietly, while the others burned themselves out. What set Vespasian apart wasn't just his military record, though it was impressive. This was a man who'd fought in Britain, Germany, and Africa. What made him truly dangerous was his ability to wait. While Galba tried to penny pinch his way to power, and Vitellius bankrupted the empire, one feast at a time, Vespasian stockpiled loyalty. In Egypt, he secured the grain supply, a move that meant he could feed or starve Rome, depending on how the Senate behaved. In Syria, he won over powerful governors who commanded large armies. In Judea, his own troops adored him because he didn't waste their lives needlessly, and he wasn't above sharing the spoils of war. Slowly, steadily, Vespasian gathered his pieces on the board, the beauty of his strategy. Let the other guys do the dirty work. Let them exhaust their forces fighting each other. Let Rome drown in its own chaos. Then, when the moment was right, bam, strike. Vespasian wasn't just a military man, he was a master networker. While Vitellius was busy spilling wine down his tunic, Vespasian's envoys were crisscrossing the empire, lining up support. Governors, generals, and key senators realized Vespasian wasn't just another pretender, he was the inevitable victor. Even the Praetorian Guard, notorious for their fickle loyalties and love of bribes, started eyeing Vespasian as their next best bet. He didn't have to promise them endless banquets or fancy games. His pitch was simple: stick with me, and you'll still have an empire to guard. And let's not forget Mucianus, the governor of Syria, a slick operator who backed Vespasian and handled much of the dirty politics, while Vespasian stayed in the east to tie up loose ends and keep his hands clean, at least by Roman standards. Vespasian's brilliance was turning himself from a distant general into the only sensible choice. Rome's Senate, terrified of Vitellius and exhausted by the endless civil war, began to see Vespasian not just as a candidate, but as salvation. By the time his armies crossed into Italy, there wasn't much fight left in the opposition. Most of Vitellius's supporters had either defected or were too busy packing for exile, and when Vespasian finally claimed the throne, he didn't enter with fireworks and parades. He didn't need to. His victory was so thorough, so carefully planned, that the empire was practically handed to him on a platter, albeit a slightly dented, wine-stained platter, thanks to Vitellius's feasts. Sure, there were battles along the way, the Second Battle of Bedriacum, the storming of Rome itself, but compared to the carnage of earlier struggles, Vespasian's rise was almost civilized. His forces won quickly, decisively, and with far less of the pointless destruction that had marked the fights between his predecessors. And here's the kicker: Vespasian didn't just take power, he brought a sense of stability that Rome hadn't seen in months. His first priority wasn't throwing a feast or building a statue. It was rebuilding the treasury and restoring order. He even introduced taxes that would fund public works instead of his own parties. Though the Romans did grumble about the infamous urine tax, Vespasian's power grab was so smooth, so well executed, that later historians would look back and almost forget just how ruthless and calculating it was. He outlasted, outwitted, and outprepared every other contender, and he did it with a patience and strategy that made him one of Rome's most respected emperors. In a year defined by chaos, Vespasian proved that sometimes the best move is to wait until everyone else has played their hand and then take the table. By the end of 69 AD, Rome was like a city that had thrown one too many wild parties and now just wanted to clean up the mess, patch the holes in the walls, and find whoever kept setting the couch on fire. Enter Vespasian. Not flashy, not dramatic, just the emperor equivalent of a sensible dad showing up with a mop, a ledger book, and a very firm voice. While everyone else during the year of the four emperors had been focused on Italy, the parades, the politics, the Praetorian Guard bribes, Vespasian quietly secured the key to controlling Rome: Egypt. Egypt wasn't just another province, it was the empire's breadbasket, the source of grain that fed millions in the capital. Control Egypt, and you could feed the people, or starve them if they got too rowdy. Vespasian didn't just waltz in and grab Alexandria, he worked the angles. The prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, was no fool. He saw the chaos unfolding in Rome, and decided that backing Vespasian wasn't just smart, it was survival. With Egypt in his pocket, Vespasian had the ultimate bargaining chip. The Senate could squabble, the Praetorians could pout, but no one wanted to face a hungry mob in the streets. By the time Vespasian arrived, Rome didn't care who was emperor, as long as he wasn't setting fire to the treasury or the furniture. Vitellius, bless his gluttonous heart, didn't see it coming. While he was busy hosting yet another feast, Vespasian's forces were storming into Italy like a tidal wave of enough is enough. Vitellius tried to hold on. He ordered barricades, begged the Praetorians to stay loyal, and even tried to negotiate. But at this point, Vitellius had about as much support as a broken stool. The final moments were brutal. Vespasian's general, Antonius Primus, led the charge into Rome. The city saw street fighting that turned neighborhoods into rubble, temples into fortresses, and taverns into war rooms. Vitellius, ever the reluctant fighter, tried to hide. Legend says he was dragged from his hiding spot, paraded through the streets in humiliation, and then swiftly executed. His body was tossed into the Tiber, a grim reminder that Rome's patience had finally run out. When the dust settled, Rome didn't erupt in wild celebration. The people didn't have the energy. After a year of civil war, looting, fires, and 4 emperors in rapid succession, the general mood was less jubilation and more thank Jupiter that's over. Imagine the city as one giant exhausted party guest slumped on the steps of a temple, muttering, "We're so done with this." Shops that hadn't been burned out reopened cautiously. The senators crept back into the curia, looking over their shoulders. Ordinary citizens cleaned up the wreckage and tried to figure out if they owed loyalty to anyone else before lunchtime. What mattered most was that the fighting had stopped. The city's granaries were full again, thanks to Egypt, and no one, absolutely no one, was sad to see Vitellius go. Vespasian's rise wasn't just about ending the chaos. It marked the start of something Rome hadn't had in years. A plan. He didn't waste time throwing massive games or building statues of himself made of solid gold. Looking at you, Nero. Instead, he got down to business. He tackled the treasury first, because after all that civil war spending and Vitellius's banquets, the empire was flat broke. He imposed taxes, including that infamous urine tax on public toilets, because apparently nothing was too small to monetize when Rome needed cash. Vespasian also began repairing Rome itself. Literally, streets were cleared of rubble, temples were restored, and the city's defenses were strengthened. After a year of watching emperors treat the throne like a prize in a tavern dice game, Romans were ready for some good old-fashioned stability. With Vitellius gone and the city back under control, Vespasian laid the foundations for the Flavian dynasty. But unlike his predecessors, he wasn't interested in ruling alone like some divine monarch. He set up a succession plan, with his sons Titus and Domitian lined up to follow him. The message was clear. The chaos is over. The grown-ups are in charge now. Vespasian's victory was more than just personal. It was Rome's chance to breathe again, to heal, and to remember that an emperor's job was supposed to be more about governing and less about feasting, fiddling, or flinging rivals into rivers. The year of the 4 emperors ended not with a bang, but with the relieved sigh of a city that had seen too much blood, too much fire, and far too many bad leaders. And while Vespasian wasn't flashy, he was exactly what Rome needed. Steady, practical, and focused on the future. Not just the next party. Historians love to write about emperors, legions, and senate debates. But what about the average Roman stuck in the middle of the world's most chaotic game of imperial hot potato? Let's just say, if you were an ordinary citizen in 69 AD, you weren't thinking about who wore the purple best. You were thinking, how do I keep my family fed, my house standing, and my goat from being requisitioned by yet another passing army? Rome prided itself on keeping its people fed, thanks to that famous grain supply from Egypt. But remember, during the year of the 4 emperors, control of that grain was a strategic prize, not a guarantee. While Vespasian eventually secured Egypt, ordinary Romans spent much of the year staring at empty bread baskets and watered-down wine. Queues outside bakeries stretched for blocks, and prices soared like an overexcited charioteer at the Circus Maximus. What little bread there was often got snatched up by soldiers or the city's rich, leaving the poor to gnaw on stale crusts or whatever they could scrounge. And wine? Forget the fancy Falernian vintage. People were lucky to find a jug of vinegar wine, the kind usually reserved for slaves or cleaning stubborn stains. The good news, you survived the battles. The bad news, your neighbor just stole your goat and called it a war tax. If you were hoping that imperial soldiers would protect you, think again. As legions marched through Italy, loyalty shifted faster than a Roman senator at a bribe auction. Soldiers looking for pay or revenge thought nothing of liberating valuables from homes, shops, and temples. Imagine waking up to find that yesterday's defenders of Rome were today's looters, hauling off your cooking pots, your spare tunic, and yes, your goat. Street fights erupted not just between rival armies, but between hungry mobs and anyone who looked like they might have a coin or two hidden away. And since the city guards were often busy switching sides or hiding from the latest conqueror, there was no one to complain to. The only law was the sharp end of a sword. On top of everything else, whoever controlled Rome at any given hour seemed to think the best way to fund their reign was to squeeze the ordinary people dry. Taxes, raised, then raised again. Otho, Galba, Vitellius. They all promised rewards to soldiers, and guess where the money came from? That's right, from shopkeepers, farmers, artisans, and anyone unlucky enough to have a roof still standing. And if you couldn't pay, well, perhaps your eldest son would like to join the army. Or maybe your tools, your donkey, or your tiny patch of vineyard would do as payment. In the countryside, conscription parties rounded up young men to refill the ranks of whichever legion was in charge that week. Saying no wasn't an option unless you fancied a one-way trip to the afterlife. But where there's chaos, there's always someone ready to profit. The Civil War gave birth to a booming black market economy. Want grain? There was always a shady character in a back alley willing to sell you a sack of the good stuff at 10 times the usual price. Need to bribe a soldier to leave your shop alone? Someone could hook you up with a protection plan. Read more bribes. Then there were the scams. Con artists sold fake imperial pardons, counterfeit coinage, or even phony claims to family land, figuring that with so much confusion, no one would check the paperwork until it was too late. Entire neighborhoods fell under the control of local strongmen or gangs who promised safety in exchange for regular payments. It was like the mafia had a practice run centuries before it became famous. It wasn't just material loss. The constant uncertainty gnawed at people's sanity. Every morning brought new rumors. Vitellius is dead. No, Otho's making a comeback. Wait, wasn't Galba resurrected by the gods? The joke was, the only thing you could count on was that you couldn't count on anything. Festivals and public gatherings all but disappeared. Who had time to celebrate Saturnalia when you were patching up your roof? for the third time that month, after soldiers used it for target practice. Temples stood empty, theatres silent, forums eerily quiet, except for whispers of the latest news, or the clink of stolen goods changing hands. By the time Vespasian's forces took control, most Romans didn't care if the new emperor wore a toga, a sackcloth, or showed up in a tunic made of fish guts. All they wanted was peace, food, and maybe the return of that goat. And so, as the dust settled, the ordinary Roman didn't cheer for Vespasian out of love. They cheered out of sheer exhaustion, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow wouldn't bring yet another round of taxes, battles, and midnight looters. While Rome tore itself apart in 69 AD, it's easy to forget that beyond the marble columns and squabbling senators lay thousands of miles of vulnerable borders. And guess what? Rome's enemies definitely didn't forget. While Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian wrestled for the throne like toddlers over a wooden sword, the tribes and kingdoms beyond the frontier watched, rubbed their hands together, and thought, well, this is convenient. Rome was so busy fighting itself that its enemies started sending thank you cards. The Roman Empire was vast. From the misty forests of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Syria, it stretched across 3 continents, and keeping it together was no small task even in normal years, whatever those were in Roman politics. But 69 AD was anything but normal. Legions that were supposed to defend the borders had been sucked into the civil war, like kids ditching their chores to join a street brawl. Garrisons along the Rhine, the Danube and the Euphrates were left dangerously thin or leaderless, as their commanders chased imperial ambitions instead of chasing off invaders. Imagine being a Roman officer stationed at some gloomy frontier fort. One day, half your men are gone, marching off to install some new emperor. The next day, smoke rises on the horizon, and it's not from your cook burning dinner. To the north, the Germanic tribes saw the Roman distraction as an open invitation. The Batavians, a fierce people from the Rhine Delta, modern Netherlands, decided that now was the perfect time to rebel. Led by the wily and charismatic Julius Civilis, they kicked off what became known as the Batavian Revolt. Civilis wasn't just some barbarian with a grudge. He was a Roman-trained officer who knew exactly how Rome's military worked. He rallied neighboring tribes, burned Roman forts, and ambushed supply lines, turning the Rhine frontier into a fiery mess. Meanwhile, other Germanic groups, always happy to join in if there was looting involved, took potshots at Roman outposts, raided towns, and generally treated the northern provinces like an all-you-can-plunder buffet. On the opposite side of the empire, the Parthian Empire, Rome's old frenemy in the east, watched the chaos unfold with a grin as wide as the Euphrates. The Parthians had long been a thorn in Rome's side, masters of cavalry and sneak attacks, and now the mighty Rome couldn't even guard its own backyard. While there's no record of a full-scale Parthian invasion during the year of the 4 emperors, they probably figured they'd wait for Rome to collapse entirely. Border skirmishes increased. Parthian forces pushed at Roman client kingdoms, tested defenses, and generally made life miserable for Roman governors who were too busy figuring out who to send taxes to this week. Rome's emperors, bless their ambitious little hearts, were far too focused on immediate survival to care about distant provinces. The Rhine frontier, the Danube, Syria, all became afterthoughts as Vitellius tried to out-eat his problems and Otho tried to out-bribe his. Governors and local commanders were left to fend for themselves. Some managed heroically. Others, let's just say they started writing those "maybe we can negotiate" letters pretty quickly. And in the chaos, local Roman settlers, traders, and townsfolk often bore the brunt of raids. Their appeals for help, answered with silence or a polite, "We're a bit busy overthrowing each other at the moment." Here's the thing about 69 AD. It taught Rome's enemies a valuable lesson. They learned that for all its grandeur, the empire could bleed. If civil war could leave the borders open once, it could happen again, and it would, many times over the coming centuries. The Batavian Revolt wasn't crushed until 70 AD, when Vespasian's generals finally sent legions north to restore order. But the scars of that rebellion lingered, and the memory of Rome's weakness stayed fresh in the minds of Rome's rivals. Let's not forget the ordinary folk at the edges of the empire. Farmers, traders, and small-town citizens, who found themselves unwilling extras in this grand imperial tragedy. One day they were sending taxes and prayers to Nero. The next, they weren't sure which emperor's name to carve on their temple's dedication stone. Trade ground to a halt as roads became unsafe, farms were burned, workshops looted, and markets deserted, and when help finally arrived, it usually meant more taxes to pay for the cost of liberation. By the time Vespasian secured the throne, the empire realized something important. It couldn't afford to ignore its borders just because it was busy staging a blood-soaked reality show in the capital. The chaos of 69 AD forced the Flavian dynasty to rethink how they protected the frontiers, leading to reforms and fortifications that would shape Roman defense strategy for decades. But for those who lived through it, the year of the four emperors would be remembered as the year when the empire's enemies didn't just knock at the door. They walked right in, helped themselves to the silverware, and didn't even bother wiping their feet. So what did Rome actually learn from its year-long experiment in imperial musical chairs? After 12 months, 4 emperors, countless battles, and enough bloodshed to fill the Colosseum, you'd think the Roman Empire would emerge wiser, stronger, and maybe with a really solid HR department. But spoiler alert, Rome being Rome, the lessons were mixed at best. 69 AD taught Rome that having 4 emperors in 1 year is like having 4 weddings in a weekend. Expensive, exhausting, and probably ending in disaster. If 69 AD had a theme, it was don't leave the empire without a plan. Nero's spectacular exit left a power vacuum so wide you could march an entire legion through it, and several did, each with their own would-be emperor in tow. After watching generals, senators, and the Praetorian Guard toss crowns around like party hats, Rome started to grasp the concept that maybe, just maybe, picking an heir before the current emperor dies in a ditch is a smart idea. Vespasian, no fool, made sure to name his son Titus as successor early on. The Flavians weren't going to repeat the chaos if they could help it. Did it prevent future disasters? Let's just say Rome kept testing this lesson for centuries. Another lesson carved into Roman memory with the pointy end of a pilum was this: the army makes emperors. Without the legion's backing, an emperor was just a guy in a fancy robe waiting to get stabbed. Galba learned it, Otho learned it, Vitellius really learned it, often between mouthfuls of roast peacock. But here's where it gets tricky. While the emperors realized that keeping the army happy was crucial, their chosen method, bribery, turned out to be as effective as using wine to put out a fire. Sure, tossing gold at the troops worked short-term, but it set a precedent. Future emperors would find themselves caught in a never-ending cycle of payouts, bonuses, and promises they couldn't possibly keep. What began in 69 AD as "let's give the boys a bonus" soon became "empty the treasury, so they don't kill me." And when the money ran out, well, history shows us how that ends. Usually with the emperor's head on a spike and a new generous candidate on the throne. In all this chaos, the Flavians emerged as the big winners. Vespasian, with his no-nonsense style and clever political maneuvers, finally brought a semblance of peace. For Romans weary of civil war, tax hikes, and waking up to find yet another imperial statue toppled in the Forum, Vespasian's rule felt like a long, deep exhale. The Flavian dynasty wasn't just about stabilizing the empire, it was about rebuilding it, both literally and figuratively. Vespasian got construction projects rolling, including that modest little arena you might have heard of, the Colosseum. Nothing says sorry about that whole civil war thing like free gladiator games. But let's not kid ourselves. While the Flavians patched up Rome's wounds, the scars of 69 AD lingered. People remembered how quickly the empire could fall apart, and how fragile even the mightiest power could be when ambition and greed ran wild. Beyond the immediate political fallout, the year of the 4 emperors left Rome with deep economic bruises. The treasury had been bled dry by bribes, civil war costs, and looting by both invaders and Rome's own troops. Provinces that had been plundered to fund rival emperors now struggled to recover. Farmers and merchants alike bore the cost, often through crushing taxes or outright theft, disguised as emergency levies. And while Vespasian worked hard to refill the imperial coffers, he even taxed public urinals, hence the phrase pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink. The lesson was clear. Civil war was bad for business. Despite everything, Rome remained Rome, gloriously resilient, and gloriously doomed to repeat its mistakes. The idea of succession planning stuck for a while, but the empire would face other chaotic transitions. Hello, Year of the 5 Emperors, Year of the 6 Emperors. The crisis of the 3rd century. The army's role in politics only grew stronger, and the dangerous precedent of military-backed emperors became baked into the imperial system. In short, 69 AD taught Rome that a strong leader, a clear heir, and loyal legions could prevent disaster. But it also taught opportunists that if you had a legion or two and enough gold, the throne could be yours for the taking until someone else outbid you. For generations, Romans would look back on the Year of the 4 Emperors as the ultimate cautionary tale. Historians like Tacitus turned it into a literary goldmine, painting a vivid picture of ambition, greed, and chaos. Poets, playwrights, and ordinary citizens alike would whisper about it as the year the gods turned their backs and let Rome learn the hard way. But hey, at least we got some good stories out of it. And for those of us today, 69 AD remains one of history's greatest hold my wine moments, proving that even the greatest empires can act like a drunken brawl at a toga party. Now let's talk about the Palace of Versailles, a masterpiece of extravagance, where every room gold, every hallway gold, every bathroom somehow still gold. Picture this, a quiet patch of swampy land outside Paris. It's the 1620s, and King Louis XIII, a man of simple pleasures, if you count being king as simple, is out hunting deer. He looks around, sniffs the mosquito-thick air, and thinks, yes, this is the spot, the perfect place to build a hunting lodge. And so, with all the enthusiasm of a king eager to get away from court politics, and probably his overbearing mother, Marie de Medici, Louis XIII ordered the construction of a modest brick and stone structure in the middle of this mosquito paradise. Now, when I say modest, I mean royal modesty, the kind where a small hunting lodge still has enough rooms to lose your favourite dog in. The original Versailles was practical. It had space for a king and his hunting party, a kitchen to roast all that venison, and enough land for sport. But it wasn't flashy. No gold leaf, no statues of gods, no mile-long driveways designed to make visitors feel inferior. In fact, had you seen it back then, you might have mistaken it for the countryside retreat of a wealthy noble, rather than the seed of one of the world's most extravagant palaces. Then along came Louis XIV, the man, the myth, the gold enthusiast. Where Louis XIV saw a cozy hunting hideaway, his son saw, well, a blank canvas. If Louis XIV had built a cabin, Louis XIV wanted to turn it into the Louvre, a cathedral, and an amusement park all rolled into one, preferably coated in gold, and with enough marble to make Italy jealous. He inherited Versailles in its humble form, and immediately thought, this could really use a makeover, and by makeover I mean demolish half of it, double its size, and add enough fountains to create a small sea. It wasn't just personal taste. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, wanted everything to revolve around him. Versailles would not just be a palace, it would be a stage. And like any great stage, it needed to be spectacular enough to make the nobility's jaws drop, and the ambassadors of Europe go home thinking, wow, France is loaded. The fact that this swampy patch of land wasn't exactly the most practical spot, minor detail. Let's talk about that location, shall we? Versailles is built on what polite people of the 1600s might have called challenging terrain. Swampy, low-lying, mosquito-infested. This was not prime real estate. Building here was like deciding to build your dream home in the middle of a bog because, hey, no neighbours. The ground was so soft and marshy that engineers had to get creative just to make sure the buildings wouldn't sink or collapse. If you've ever tried to put up a tent at a muddy festival, you can sympathise. Now imagine doing that with thousands of tons of stone. The result? An endless cycle of building, rebuilding, and reinforcing. Louis XIV's architects and engineers had the delightful task of turning a swamp into a royal paradise. Imagine renovating your house for 50 years and never once saying that's enough mirrors. That's exactly what happened, because every time they finished a wing, or a garden, or a fountain, the king would decide he wanted something grander, shinier, or with more gold leaf. What started as a modest expansion of his dad's lodge became a lifelong project, and a bottomless money pit. To give you a sense of scale by the time Louis XIV was done, well, He wasn't really done, he just died first. Versailles sprawled across thousands of acres. It had over 2,000 windows. The gardens alone covered more land than some small countries. The cost, astronomical. The king poured so much money into the palace that France's finances were stretched to the breaking point. But hey, at least he had a nice place to throw a party. And those parties? Oh, they were legendary, but more on that later. For now, know that Versailles was born out of a combination of royal ego, artistic ambition, and a complete disregard for things like budgets or sensible locations. Where most people would see an impractical swamp, Louis XIV saw a blank page on which to write his golden legacy. The palace grew, the mirrors multiplied, and the gold leaf flowed like water. Versailles was transformed from a simple hunting lodge into the ultimate symbol of royal extravagance. And in case you're wondering how future kings handled this gold-plated inheritance, let's just say they inherited the building and the bills. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another chapter. If you were to describe Louis XIV in one word, it would probably be extra. But since this is history, let's be generous and give him a whole chapter. After all, this was a man who didn't just want to rule France. He wanted to be France, and if possible, he wanted to do it in red heels. Louis XIV was born in 1638, and from the very start, he believed he was special. And not in the "my mum says I'm special" way, but in the "I am chosen by God to rule, so please address me as the Sun King" kind of way. He wasn't just a king, he was the center of everything. The state, that was him. The court, that revolved around him. The nobles, they existed to flatter him. The universe, frankly, lucky to have him. His personal motto could have been "go big or go home, and then build a bigger home." Louis XIV's vision wasn't just to be powerful, it was to be unforgettable. His idea of monarchy was absolute, and his style of ruling, a blend of political genius, PR mastermind, and fashion icon. If you consider gold embroidery and wigs the size of small sheep to be fashion. Spoiler, in the 17th century, they definitely did. And nowhere did this obsession with image shine brighter than at Versailles. The palace wasn't just a house, it was a monument to Louis XIV's ego. Every fountain, every corridor, every ceiling painted with gods and angels was a message. Look at me, worship me. Oh, and don't forget to admire the drapes. Versailles was carefully designed to make visitors feel small, and the king feel, well, solar. Because when you call yourself the Sun King, subtlety is already out the window. But Louis didn't stop at architecture. No, he extended this philosophy to every minute of his daily life. Imagine living a day where brushing your teeth, or whatever the 1730 century equivalent was, came with an audience. That was Louis XIV. From the moment he woke up, the king was on stage. His lever, the royal getting up ceremony, was a full-blown event. Nobles jostled for the privilege of handing him his shirt or his slippers, or maybe just standing close enough to catch a whiff of royal perfume. Breakfast, also public. Lunch, same. Dinner, you guessed it, a performance with nobles and foreign dignitaries staring at him as he chewed. Privacy? That's for peasants. Even going to bed was a ritual, with nobles crowding in to wish him good night, like over-enthusiastic relatives at a family reunion. Every part of his routine reinforced the idea that he was no ordinary man. He was the king, chosen by God, and everyone had better act like it. And then there was the fashion. Louis XIV wasn't content to simply rule. He had to look the part too. His wardrobe was legendary, overflowing with velvet, silk, lace, and more embroidery than your grandmother's entire quilt collection. The man had over 200 tailors on staff, dedicated solely to making sure the Sun King shone brightly at all times. His outfits were so ornate that it's a wonder he could walk without tripping over his own cuffs. And let's not forget the shoes, those famous red heels. Louis made red-heeled shoes a symbol of status, power, and royal swagger. The man had 200 tailors and still picked red heels. Bold. And soon, the nobles were all tottering around in them. Because nothing says loyalty like matching footwear. Of course, all of this excess wasn't just vanity, though there was plenty of that. Louis XIV's obsession with image was part of a grand strategy. By surrounding himself with ritual, spectacle, and gold-threaded curtains, he kept the nobles busy, too busy to plot against him, too dazzled to question him, and too broke after trying to keep up with royal fashion to fund any rebellions. He turned the French court into the greatest theatre on earth. with himself as the star, and everyone else as a very enthusiastic supporting cast. But behind the gold and glory was a man who worked tirelessly to maintain his image. Louis XIV micromanaged everything from military campaigns to garden designs, from tax policy to the color scheme of his latest ballroom. He had no time for relaxation. Every day was another opportunity to reinforce his power. To Louis, kingship wasn't a job, it was a performance that never ended. And so, when you walk through Versailles today, remember that it's not just a palace, it's the ultimate expression of one man's dream to be seen, admired, and obeyed. A place where the Sun King's light was meant to shine forever, or at least until the revolutionaries showed up. But that, my friend, is another chapter. If Louis XIV wanted to be the Sun King, Versailles was the blazing sun itself, all gold leaf, endless corridors, and so much symmetry it could give a mathematician heart palpitations. The architecture of Versailles wasn't just about beauty, it was about sending a message. Behold my power, behold my taste, and behold your reflection, because I'm generous like that. Let's start with the palace's grand design. The entire complex was built like a cosmic diagram, with the king's bedroom at the very center. From that sacred space, everything radiated outward, like the rays of the sun, because subtlety was, let's face it, not really Louis XIV's thing. The layout was symmetrical to the point of obsession. Wings, courtyards, and galleries lined up so precisely that if you stood in the right spot, you could look down an axis that seemed to stretch into infinity. It wasn't just architecture, it was geometry with gold trim. And speaking of endless stretches, the corridors of Versailles were designed to remind everyone just how small they were in the face of royal grandeur. You could walk for what felt like miles, surrounded by marble, tapestries, and gilded mouldings, and still not reach the throne room. It was like a really fancy cardio workout, one where every step reinforced the idea that the king was very far away, very important, and probably too busy to see you. But the crown jewel of this architectural extravaganza, the Hall of Mirrors, because what's better than looking at yourself? Looking at yourself in 357 mirrors. Yes, 357, because apparently 356 just wouldn't do. This gallery stretched over 70 meters, lined with massive arched windows on one side and those famous mirrors on the other. Sunlight poured in, bouncing off the mirrors, the chandeliers, and of course, all the gold. The effect was dazzling, literally. Some visitors probably left the Hall of Mirrors unsure if they'd just seen the grandeur of France, or stared into the sun. The hall wasn't just pretty, it was a political weapon. Every time a foreign ambassador entered, they had to walk its length, surrounded by reflections of France's wealth and power, until they reached the king. Imagine being an envoy from some smaller kingdom, trying to act cool, while your own stunned face stared back at you a few hundred times. Mission accomplished, Louis. And then there were the gardens. Ah, the gardens. Calling them gardens is like calling the ocean a puddle. Designed by landscape architect André Lenoutre, the gardens of Versailles were so enormous that maps were practically required for survival. We're talking over 2,000 acres of sculpted hedges, geometric flower beds, and groves where noble guests could stroll, flirt, or get hopelessly lost. The layout was as strict as the palace itself. Perfect lines, precise angles, and everything laid out in harmony with the palace's central axis. Nature was tamed, trimmed, and forced into neat, symmetrical submission. A bit like the nobility, really. But here's the thing. The gardens weren't just for looks, they were designed for drama. Hidden groves contained fountains, statues, and even entire outdoor theatres. Surprise performances, water displays, and fireworks could erupt at any moment. It wasn't a garden. It was Versailles' second stage. And yes, it was so big you could get lost and still die of dehydration before finding a door. If you ever visit, pack snacks. Of course, all those fountains weren't just for fun. They were feats of engineering and desperation. The fountains of Versailles were famous across Europe, spraying water high into the air in dazzling patterns. But the secret behind them, the entire thing was a logistical nightmare. The palace was built in the wrong spot, as we discussed earlier. Swampy, low, and not exactly a natural reservoir. Supplying water to all those fountains took an army of engineers and a whole lot of money. France didn't really have to spare. The system that powered them, known as the Machine de Marly, was one of the most ambitious hydraulic projects of its time. Enormous water wheels on the Seine pumped water uphill to Versailles, over distances and elevations that made even seasoned engineers cry into their blueprints. It took hundreds of men to keep it running, and even then, they could never supply enough water for all the fountains to operate at once. In fact, they ran them in sequence as the king moved through the gardens. Louis walks by, fountains on. Louis turns a corner, quick, switch them off before the pipes burst. It was like a royal light show, but with water and panic instead of electricity, and all this came at a staggering cost. The treasury strained under the weight of Versailles' hydraulic ambitions, but did that stop Louis? Not for a second, because in the Sun King's world, no expense was too great if it meant dazzling the court, humbling foreign dignitaries, or simply showing off. In the end, the architecture of Versailles wasn't just about buildings and gardens, it was a physical manifestation of royal ego, a place where gold met geometry, and where power was measured not in laws or armies, but in square meters of marble and gallons of water pumped uphill. And if it left France's finances gasping for air, well, at least the fountains looked nice. Imagine a world where your survival depended not on strength or bravery, but on how well you could compliment a man's wig without sounding insincere. Welcome to court life at Versailles, where the silk was fine, the gossip finer, and the stakes higher than any card game. For the nobles trapped inside this golden cage, life was a never-ending performance where the wrong word or the wrong outfit could send your fortunes plummeting faster than you could say, "Your Majesty's lace is divine today." Living at Versailles meant existing under constant scrutiny. Everything was a game of appearances. You weren't just expected to look good, you had to excel at it. Imagine dressing in layers of embroidered silk, balancing a hat the size of a small carriage, and teetering around in shoes that seemed designed for tripping hazards. And on top of all that, you had to smile, flatter, and deliver the perfect bow, all while avoiding the courtier equivalent of stepping on a rake offending someone more powerful. And make no mistake, Versailles was a jungle, but instead of lions and tigers, it was packed with nobles, all of them prowling for favor, position, and the chance to whisper something damaging into the right ear. Every hallway, salon and garden path was a battlefield of sly glances and subtle insults hidden beneath layers of politeness. Oh, the Countess's gown. How brave of her to wear last year's style. Nothing stung like a compliment with teeth. The brilliance of Versailles, at least from Louis XIV's point of view, was that it kept these would-be troublemakers right where he could see them. The nobility might have dreamed of plotting rebellions or building power bases in the provinces. But how could they, when they were too busy jockeying for the best seat at dinner or trying to get a prime spot in the king's daily rituals? One of the Sun King's greatest political strategies wasn't a battle or a law. It was making sure his nobles were too distracted by court life to rebel. It's hard to rebel when you're too busy fighting for the best seat at dinner. Let's talk about those rituals. The king's daily routine wasn't private. Far from it. His mornings began with the liver, where courtiers packed into his chambers to watch him wake up and get dressed. And this wasn't just polite interest. Positions like holding the king's shirt or passing him his gloves were fiercely competed for, because every small moment near Louis was a chance to gain favor. Brushing the king's hair, that wasn't a simple task. It was practically a spectator sport, with the audience hoping to catch his eye, or at least a hint of royal approval. Imagine needing to win a popularity contest just to hand over a comb. Meals were no different. The king often dined in public, seated at a grand table while courtiers watched him eat. Some lucky few were invited to sit or stand nearby, while others lined the walls, hoping to be noticed. And yes, there was protocol for everything. Where you stood, how you bowed, even how you looked at the king. Too eager? Desperate. Not eager enough. Disrespectful. It was like walking a tightrope strung between chandeliers. And then there was the fashion. Ah, the fashion. At Versailles, what you wore wasn't just personal taste. It was a survival strategy. The rules were strict, the expectations ridiculous, and the consequences of getting it wrong could be social disaster. Ladies wore dresses so wide they needed sideways maneuvering to get through doorways. Gentlemen sported coats so heavy with embroidery that one good rainstorm could drown them in soggy velvet. And let's not forget the wigs. Enormous, powdered, and often festooned with feathers, jewels, or tiny model ships. Yes, really. Just walking down a corridor became a feat of balance and neck strength. But comfort? That was for peasants. Fashion at court was designed to be a display, not a delight. Corsets squeezed waists to breathless proportions, shoes pinched toes, and layers upon layers of fabric turned summer days into personal saunas. Chairs in many salons were more decorative than functional, meaning that even resting was an ordeal. The goal wasn't to feel good, it was to look good, at any cost. Fashion rules that made sure no one could sit comfortably, literally, because what better way to remind the nobility of their place than to make sure they were always just a little bit miserable while showing off their wealth. Yet for all its discomfort and danger, court life had its rewards. The right smile at the right moment could win you a pension, a title, or a glittering marriage alliance. A clever remark could secure a post or land grant, and a well-timed gift, say, a portrait of Louis with extra gold leaf, could open doors that had been closed for years. Versailles was the ultimate stage, and those who played their roles well could rise high indeed. But one misstep, one fashion faux pas, one careless word, and it was back to the provinces, or worse, to obscurity. In the end, life as a courtier at Versailles was a masterclass in survival. It was a place where the knives were hidden behind fans, the battles were fought with words and glances, and the spoils went to those who could flatter the best while wearing the most uncomfortable shoes in Europe. And somehow, they did it all with a smile. Because at Versailles the performance never stopped. At Versailles nothing was done in moderation, and that included eating. If the architecture was designed to make jaws drop, then the banquets were meant to leave jaws sore. Feasting at the Sun King's court wasn't just about nourishment. It was a theatrical production where the food was excessive, the portions insane, and table manners could make or break your future. And yes, as glamorous as it looked, it was often as much a digestive nightmare as it was a political minefield. Let's begin with the banquets themselves. Picture endless rows of tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, venison, pheasants, peacocks, sometimes served with their feathers reattached. For that extra flair, mountains of pastries, towers of candied fruit, and an ocean of wine. The sheer quantity of food bordered on the absurd, more than could be eaten by everyone combined, and certainly more than was wise for anyone to attempt. It was abundance for abundance sake. Proof that France was rich, the king was generous, and no guest would ever leave hungry, or at least, that was the idea. But in reality, much of that lavish food was ice cold by the time it reached the king. The kitchens of Versailles weren't tucked conveniently beside the dining halls. They were located far away in separate buildings. Why? Because the palace was so gigantic that practicalities like keeping food warm were sacrificed at the altar of design. Servants would carry platters on a journey worthy of a marathon runner, dodging nobles, pets, and the occasional rogue musician, only to arrive with a dish that had long since lost its sizzle. More food than could ever be eaten, and 90% of it cold by the time it reached the king. And what about breakfast, you ask? Well, let's just say breakfast at Versailles wasn't about jump-starting your day with energy. It was more like a parade of bread, butter, and weak wine that you consumed because it appeared in front of you. Breakfast didn't energize you, it just happened to you. Nobles would nibble at bits of brioche, sip watered wine or hot chocolate, and pretend it was exactly what they wanted while trying to look elegant about it. No one dared ask for something heartier. After all, breakfast wasn't meant to nourish. It was another opportunity to demonstrate your refinement, feeling faint with hunger. Too bad. At least your posture was perfect. And speaking of refinement, table manners at Versailles could make or break your social standing faster than spilling gravy on your lace cuffs. This wasn't just about which fork to use. It was about every tiny movement you made at the table, how you unfolded your napkin, how you lifted your goblet, how gracefully you reached for a slice of bread without looking like you were lunging for it. Everything mattered. One wrong move, one goblet held a fraction too high or too low, and you risked becoming the subject of that evening's gossip. It wasn't enough to eat. You had to look like you belonged to the aristocracy while doing it, even if inside you were starving and wondering how long the meal would last. Meals could stretch for hours, with course after course parading out in a display of wealth and power. And while nobles struggled to maintain their composure, the behind-the-scenes reality in the kitchens was anything but polished. Versailles' kitchens were enormous, hot, chaotic, and frankly, fire hazards waiting to happen. Open flames roared from huge hearths, Dozens of cooks shouted orders and bumped into each other, and servants scurried like panicked mice, trying to get dishes out before they cooled into disappointment. The risk of a kitchen fire was very real, and occasionally parts of the palace or outbuildings did go up in smoke, all in service of preparing one more over-the-top feast. The kitchens were also notorious for their, let's say, lack of modern hygiene. Food preparation at Versailles wasn't quite the sparkling, sanitized process we might imagine. With hundreds of dishes being prepared simultaneously, cleanliness often took a back seat to speed, and while the food looked magnificent by the time it reached the royal table, you might not want to inspect what happened on the way there too closely. And of course, with all that feasting, the rich sauces, the heavy meats, the endless wine, came another, less glamorous truth about Versailles. Flatulence was a fact of life, though nobody spoke of it, at least, not loudly. The digestive struggles of the nobility were as legendary as the meals themselves. After hours of rich food, tight corsets, and trying to sit politely on delicate chairs, it's no wonder some nobles probably prayed for an early end to the meal, just so they could find a private corner and breathe, or burp, or worse. In the end, food at Versailles was about spectacle, not sustenance. The feasts weren't designed to satisfy hunger, they were designed to satisfy egos, display wealth, and remind everyone that if you were at that table, you were part of the elite. Whether or not you left full, or with your dignity intact, was entirely secondary, because at Versailles, the meal wasn't just food, it was politics on a plate, served cold, with a side of heartburn. Ah, Versailles, a palace of unimaginable beauty, dazzling gold, endless mirrors, and the unmistakable aroma of humanity. While history remembers the glittering halls and ornate gardens, few dwell on one of the palace's most enduring features, its, shall we say, unique approach to hygiene. Beneath the silk and jewels lurked the undeniable truth that, for all its splendor, Versailles stank, and it stank gloriously. Let's begin with what will shock modern ears the most. In its early days, Versailles had almost no proper bathrooms. You might expect a palace of such grandeur to be equipped with elegant facilities, but no, the Sun King could afford armies of tailors. But installing a sensible number of toilets, apparently that was too much. For decades, Versailles was essentially a giant golden maze with very few designated places to go. The result? Nobles and servants improvised, often with less than charming results. Corners, stairwells, secluded alcoves, no nook was safe from the desperate. It wasn't unheard of for a noble to discreetly or not so discreetly relieve themselves behind a tapestry or in a hallway. Imagine walking through a grand corridor lined with priceless art, only to find yourself dodging puddles left by someone's unfortunate digestive emergency. Visitors frequently complained of the smell, but what could they do? Versailles was in many ways an olfactory assault course. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so is the smell. Of course, chamber pots were available, but these too brought their own absurdities. At Versailles, even a humble chamber pot could become a status symbol. The more elaborately decorated, the better. Some were made of fine porcelain, painted with intricate designs, or even set in gilded holders, because nothing says refinement like emptying your bowels into something that looks like it belongs in a museum. But these pots weren't just for private use in bedrooms. Oh no, servants often carried them discreetly as nobles moved through the palace, ready to present the pot at a moment's notice. And if you think that sounds like an accident waiting to happen, you're right. Many a courtier's expensive shoes or hemline fell victim to a spilled chamber pot during an ill-timed bump in the corridor. As for waste disposal, let's just say the palace's plumbing or lack thereof didn't help. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows or into courtyards with shocking regularity. The palace grounds became dotted with what polite society called nuisances, and what everyone else called exactly what they were. On warm days, the smell could rival that of the most crowded barnyard, and when rain came, it wasn't just water trickling through those famous gardens. Naturally, in the absence of proper sanitation, perfume became Versailles' favourite solution to life's smelliest problems. The court was drenched in it. Nobles, furniture, even the walls were sometimes sprayed with scented waters in a desperate attempt to mask the palace's signature funk. There was no such thing as too much. Florals, musks, citrus. Versailles was a walking, talking perfume shop. And while the scents may have helped to disguise certain odours temporarily, They couldn't do much about the diseases brewing beneath the surface. No perfume, no matter how powerful, could protect you from the health hazards created by living in a giant, unwashed crowd. But at least you'd smell divine while getting sick. Hygiene, as we think of it today, was practically a foreign concept at Versailles. Bathing was rare, and when it did happen, it was often more symbolic than effective. Many nobles believed that water could spread disease, so they preferred to wipe themselves down with scented cloths rather than risk a full soak. Changing clothes frequently, especially underwear, was seen as the key to cleanliness. The result, people at court might wear fresh linen but go weeks without actually washing their bodies. So while the lace collars and satin breeches sparkled, the skin beneath was often in dire need of a good scrub. The lack of bathrooms also meant that the palace's staff faced a never-ending battle to keep things even remotely presentable. Cleaning crews, often composed of lower servants, worked tirelessly to haul away waste, scrub floors and air out rooms, but they were fighting a losing battle. Every day brought new deposits, and with thousands of people living, working and visiting the palace at any given time, the sheer volume of mess was overwhelming. And let's not forget the psychological effect of living amid this constant stench. Nobles became masters of polite denial, turning up their noses literally and figuratively at the odours while pretending nothing was amiss. After all, acknowledging the problem would mean admitting that the palace of perfection was in fact a giant gilded latrine in places. Far better to comment on someone's lovely waistcoat than on the unfortunate puddle by the grand staircase. In the end, Versailles' hygiene situation was a reminder that beneath the surface of power, beauty, and wealth lay a very human reality. Everyone had to answer nature's call, even in the most extravagant palace on earth, and no amount of gold, silk, or perfume could hide that truth forever. At Versailles, boredom was considered a personal insult to the king. If you were a noble living there, your job wasn't just to flatter Louis XIII. It was to act suitably amazed, entertained, and dazzled at all times. And if that meant spending your nights watching bad ballet or losing a small fortune at cards, so be it. After all, if your party didn't bankrupt a small province, was it really a party? Let's start with the endless parties. The Sun King loved a good spectacle, so much so that quiet evening simply wasn't part of the Versailles vocabulary. Almost every night, some grand event unfolded. Balls, masquerades, operas, comedies, concerts, fireworks shows that could rival a modern 4th of July. And of course, no expense was spared. Hundreds of candles lit the halls, musicians played for hours, and actors, singers, and dancers performed elaborate pieces, commissioned solely to entertain the court. Sometimes, entire buildings or gardens were constructed just for a single evening's amusement. Because why stop at excess when you can bulldoze right through it? Now, about those ballets, here's where things get truly delightful. You might imagine the performances featured professional dancers. You'd be wrong. Louis XIV, the self-declared Sun King, adored dance, and frequently starred in these ballets himself. Yes, imagine the king, decked out in a bejeweled costume, tights hugging his royal calves, striking poses as Apollo, or some other suitably majestic figure. And as king, Louis didn't just attend performances, he was the performance. His nobles followed his lead, many of them taking part in these productions, whether or not they had a shred of talent. The result? Grand spectacles of nobles in wigs and satin tripping over their own feet, all while trying desperately to look graceful. Dignity, that's for people without titles. But dancing wasn't the only entertainment on the menu. Gambling was another favorite pastime at Versailles, and it was taken seriously. Cards, dice, and other games of chance were played for staggering sums. A noble could walk into a party wealthy and leave at dawn bankrupt, or vice versa. Fortunes changed hands over a single hand of cards, and the tension around those gaming tables was often as thick as the perfume in the air. Losing wasn't just about money, either. A poorly timed defeat could mean falling out of favor at court. Winning too much? That might breed dangerous jealousy. It was a delicate, high-stakes dance in its own right. And then there were the duels, officially discouraged but unofficially thrilling. Duels were the logical outcome of a society fueled by pride, gossip, and the occasional cheating at cards. A slight at a party, an insult about a wig, a drunken remark, all could lead to swords being drawn at dawn. Versailles was a palace of performance, and that included the deadly serious art of defending one's honor. Of course, dueling on palace grounds was frowned upon, too much mess on the marble floors. But that didn't stop hot-headed nobles from arranging meetings just beyond the gates. No grand entertainment at Versailles was complete without fireworks. And oh, how they loved their fireworks. These displays weren't just a few rockets fired into the sky. They were massive, choreographed pyrotechnic ballets, designed to awe and occasionally terrify. Entire evenings were built around these shows, with guests gathered in the gardens or on balconies, gazing up as the night was torn apart by colour and sound. But as with all things Versailles, subtlety was not invited. The fireworks were so ambitious that they sometimes went spectacularly wrong. More than one display ended with parts of the gardens singed, statues scorched, or wigs lightly toasted. And yes, there are reports of guests catching stray sparks, because at Versailles, entertainment always came with a hint of danger. Perhaps most remarkable was how these entertainments served the king's ultimate purpose: control. By keeping the nobles endlessly occupied with parties, performances and wagers, Louis XIV ensured they had neither the time nor the energy to plot against him. Who could think of rebellion when they were busy sewing sequins on a ballet costume, or trying to remember the steps to a minuet? Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a gilded trap, and entertainment was the bait. And so the court at Versailles danced, gambled, duelled, and clapped for fireworks, night after night, year after year. Their dignity may have occasionally gone up in smoke along with the fireworks, but their loyalty to the king, well, that stayed right where Louis wanted it. Because at the end of the day, nothing reminded everyone who was in charge quite like a party that could bankrupt a province or set one on fire. If Versailles dazzled the eye, it also emptied the treasury. Behind every golden doorknob, marble column, and fountain, spraying water, like France, had no budget for anything else, lay a simple truth: this masterpiece of extravagance cost a fortune. Actually, several fortunes. Possibly enough to fund a small moon colony, if Louis XIV had been born in the 20th century instead. But back in the 17th and 18th centuries, all that cash went into making sure the Sun King's reflection looked good in 357 mirrors. Let's talk numbers. Estimates suggest Versailles cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of livres over its construction and expansion. That's billions in today's money. Pocket change if you're a modern tech billionaire, but absolutely ruinous if you're a pre-revolutionary nation trying to feed its people. Where did all that money go? Well, first, there was the gold leaf. Because why stop at gilding furniture when you can gild everything? Door frames, ceilings, picture frames, railings. If it could be gilded, it was. Versailles wasn't designed so much as bedazzled. Then there was the marble. Versailles devoured marble like a modern influencer devours iced coffee. The palace's builders hauled it in from quarries across France and beyond, because nothing says divine right of kings quite like walking on floors made of polished stone while your peasants walk barefoot in mud. The sheer amount of marble in Versailles could probably rebuild a small city today, or at least an outrageously fancy bathroom showroom. And let's not forget the fountains. Oh, the fountains, dozens of them, each designed to impress visitors with France's mastery over nature and its apparent disdain for budgeting. These weren't simple little water features. They were elaborate, sculpted, mechanical wonders that required mind-bending feats of engineering and more than a little magic in the form of human labor. Water had to be pumped, often from miles away, just to keep them flowing. The fountains alone ate up sums of money that might have, in more practical hands, been spent on things like roads, hospitals, or, feeding the population. Speaking of human labor, Versailles wasn't built by magic. It was built by an army, tens of thousands of workers who toiled for decades to turn a mosquito-infested swamp into a palace of dreams. Masons, carpenters, sculptors, painters, gardeners, goldsmiths. The list goes on. Some were highly skilled artisans, masters of their craft. Others were day laborers or soldiers drafted into building duty. And while the king's court sparkled with jewels, many of these workers went unpaid for long stretches, or were paid so little that they could barely afford to eat. Conditions could be brutal: long hours, dangerous tasks, and for the unlucky, injuries or death from accidents on the job. It turns out that building a monument to one man's ego wasn't great for worker safety. So how did the crown afford all this? Well, the short answer is, it didn't. Instead, The state squeezed the money out of the population, mostly the poor. Taxes were levied on peasants, small farmers, and tradespeople, while the nobility and clergy naturally enjoyed all the sparkle with none of the bill. If you were a peasant in 17th century France, odds are you were working your fingers to the bone just to scrape together enough to pay taxes, so that the king could add another gold-plated candlestick to his bedroom. Picture a farmer watching his crops fail from drought, knowing his taxes had helped fund a new marble staircase no one in his village would ever see. By the time Louis XIV's successors came along, Versailles had become a symbol of everything wrong with royal excess. The building itself was breathtaking, but so was the debt. Every chandelier, every gold-lined door, every mile of carefully clipped hedges whispered a silent truth. France's economy was in serious trouble. Versailles was where the dream of gold came true, and where the economy went to sleep. The palace glowed, but the kingdom groaned. And perhaps the most tragic part, for all that spending, Versailles wasn't even finished in any final sense. There was always another wing to add, another room to decorate, another garden to design. The palace was like a very expensive hobby that the king couldn't quit, and that the country couldn't afford. Generations of kings poured money into it, even as famine, war, and unrest brewed outside its gilded gates. In the end, Versailles stood as the ultimate flex, a breathtaking, bankrupting monument to royal pride. It was as if the king had written a giant check that his countrymen would spend generations trying and failing to cash. And when the revolution came, the people remembered. The sparkle of Versailles didn't just light up the sky, it lit the fuse. For decades, Versailles had been the glittering heart of French monarchy, a place where gold dripped from every ceiling, fountains sprayed like France had never heard of a drought, and nobles strutted around like peacocks in powdered wigs. But by the late 1780s, all that sparkle had begun to tarnish. Outside the palace's gates, ordinary people weren't dazzled anymore. They were angry, hungry, and ready to flip the table. Versailles wasn't just a palace anymore. It was the symbol of royal excess. Everything the revolution would soon try to burn down, sometimes literally. To understand how Versailles came to represent everything wrong with the Ancien regime, you have to look at what it stood for. The palace wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Look upon my works, you peasants, and despair. Versailles flaunted wealth at a time when most French people couldn't afford a crust of bread. It was a place where a single night's party could cost more than an entire village made in a year, where gold leaf covered the walls while villagers patched their roofs with straw. The palace became a giant, gleaming reminder of the gap between those who had everything and those who had nothing. And when revolution started brewing, that gap became a gaping wound. Inside the palace, the royal family lived a life that was increasingly uneasy. Louis XVI wasn't his great-great-grandfather, the Sun King. He wasn't even a flickering candle king. Where Louis XIV had been all ego and ambition, Louis XVI was indecisive, awkward, and in way over his powdered head. He and Marie Antoinette retreated into the palace's luxury as things got worse outside. Marie's private escape, the Petit Tyrian, became infamous as a playground where the queen could play shepherdess, while actual shepherds starved. The royal couple heard the rumblings of revolution, but Versailles was a bubble, and they stayed inside it as long as they could, hoping, somehow, that the storm would pass. It didn't. The storm arrived on foot. In October 1789, thousands of women, fed up with food shortages, high prices, and royal indifference, marched from Paris to Versailles. These weren't courtiers or ladies-in-waiting. These were market women, mothers, workers, furious, determined, and armed with whatever they could grab. Picture them storming toward the palace, shouting not for gold or glory, but for bread. Their demand was simple: feed us. Oh, and while we're here, maybe hand over a chandelier or two as compensation for centuries of suffering. Versailles' gates, which had kept out the cold winds of reality for so long, couldn't keep out the march of history. The women's march wasn't just about hunger, it was about power. By the time they reached Versailles, the king had no choice but to listen. The crowd broke into the palace, clashing with guards, demanding that Louis and his family return to Paris where they could be held accountable. The royal family's flight from Versailles, not the secret midnight escape they might have wished for, but a slow, humiliating procession, marked the beginning of the end for the palace as a seat of royal power. They left under guard, with the people watching, jeering, and dragging their king and queen back to the city they had tried so hard to rule from a distance. Versailles, abandoned by its royal occupants, became something else entirely, a symbol of a world that was crumbling. Where once it had been filled with music, laughter, and the clatter of card games, it now echoed with emptiness. The revolutionaries didn't immediately torch the place, though some probably wanted to. Instead, Versailles stood as a haunting monument, proof of the old regime's folly. The gold still gleamed, the mirrors still reflected, but now they reflected ghosts. The palace was no longer a stage for royal power. It was a relic, a reminder of how the mighty could fall, and fall they did. Louis and Marie tried to escape Paris in 1791, in what has to be one of history's least successful getaways. Tip: when fleeing the country, maybe don't bring a giant royal carriage that screams, "Hey, look at me, I'm the king." They were caught, dragged back, and eventually lost their heads. Literally. Meanwhile, Versailles faded into the background, no longer a center of anything except awkward memories. It became for a while a museum of excess, a giant empty shell that whispered to every visitor, "This is what happens when gold blinds you to reality." Versailles survived the revolution physically, but its soul, that shimmering heart of royal grandeur, was shattered. What had once been the glittering prize of kings was now the people's property, a monument not to glory, but to the downfall of a dream, gilded in gold and doomed by greed. Versailles, once the glittering epicenter of royal power, now welcomes a different kind of court, the court of tourists. They come in droves, millions of them every year, armed not with powdered wigs or petitions for bread, but with cameras, smartphones, and an unshakable determination to take the perfect selfie. The palace that once existed to glorify one man now exists to fill social media feeds across the globe. If Louis XIV could see it, he'd probably approve. After all, what's more on brand for the Sun King than being admired by crowds centuries after you're gone? But let's back up a bit. How did Versailles even survive into our time? The palace could easily have been destroyed during the French Revolution, when mobs stormed the gates and royal heads rolled. It could have crumbled during the Napoleonic era, or been flattened in the world wars that later swept across France. And yet, somehow it didn't. It stood, sometimes neglected, sometimes looted, sometimes repurposed, but it stood. It was too grand, too iconic, too soaked in history to be erased. Even those who despised what it represented couldn't bring themselves to tear it down completely. Instead, they left it as a reminder. This is what happens when rulers lose touch with reality. Today, Versailles is one of the most visited landmarks in the world, a vast museum of grandeur that feels almost surreal in its scale. The splendor is still there. The Hall of Mirrors gleams as it did in Louis XIV's day, though now the only royalty reflected in those mirrors tends to be the occasional pop star visiting on tour. The gardens remain meticulously maintained, stretching endlessly into the horizon, a living canvas of geometric perfection, trimmed hedges, and fountains that still dance in the sunlight. You can almost hear the ghost of a courtier sighing as yet another tourist asks, "Is this where Marie Antoinette said, 'Let them eat cake'?" Spoiler, she didn't say that. But hey, why let facts ruin a good Instagram caption? And oh, the tourists. Versailles today is a kingdom of crowds. Lines snake around the gates, full of visitors from every corner of the earth, waiting to step into history. Inside, selfie sticks rise like a forest, and the soft murmur of guides explaining the significance of this gilded ceiling or that priceless tapestry competes with the click-click of camera shutters. The palace's modern soundtrack is less harpsichord, more ringtone. The visitors shuffle along the parquet floors, gazing at the opulence and trying not to bump into one another while angling for that shot that says, "I was here. I saw the gold. Now let's get ice cream." There's less gold now, of course. Some lost to revolution, some to the passage of time. But what remains is still enough to make your average billionaire feel like they need to step up their interior design game. And beyond the sparkle, there's something deeper, a sense of awe, of stepping into a place where history wasn't just made, it was performed on a stage larger and shinier than almost any other. Versailles today balances on the line between museum and monument, between tribute and warning. It's an artistic achievement, a masterpiece of architecture and design, but also a cautionary tale. It reminds us what happens when rulers confuse personal glory with national good. when they build gold bathrooms while their people can't afford bread, when they make fountains flow but let the economy run dry. It's beauty and it's hubris. Frozen in marble, glass, and stone. Of course, none of that stops people from buying fridge magnets, shaped like the palace or keychains, with tiny replicas of the Hall of Mirrors. Versailles today is also big business. The palace has been restored, polished, and presented to the world as France's glittering crown jewel, a place where tourists can marvel at the excess without having to live under it. And if Louis XIV is watching from whatever royal afterlife he believed in, he's probably pleased. The palace still draws admirers. His masterpiece still turns heads. The sun may have set on the monarchy, but the palace of the Sun King still shines. So what's the legacy of Versailles? It's many things at once. A symbol of artistic triumph, a cautionary tale of royal overreach, a place where history's echo is drowned out only by the hum of air conditioning and the chatter of guided tours. Versailles today, slightly less gold, 100% more selfie sticks, and still as dazzling and as complicated as ever. The Sahara, a vast sun-scorched expanse of sand, rock and broken dreams stretching across North Africa, like Mother Nature's "Do Not Enter" sign. It's the kind of place where even the camels look at you like, really? You thought this was a good idea? And yet, for centuries, European explorers couldn't resist. They saw this 9 million square kilometer furnace and thought, yes, let's go walk across it, in wool suits. So why did the Sahara, a desert so hot and hostile that water evaporates just from hearing its name, become the obsession of mapmakers, adventurers, and imperial daydreamers? The deadly allure, let's discover what locals already know. To the people who lived at its edges, Berbers, Tuaregs, Arabs, the Sahara wasn't some mysterious land waiting to be discovered. It was home. A tough, unforgiving home where you learned to read the stars better than any book, where survival depended on knowing when a mirage was just a trick of the light, and when it meant death. But to Europeans gazing at the blank patches on their maps, the Sahara was a riddle wrapped in a mirage, baked in sand, and sprinkled with the promise of glory. Every blank space on the chart was a temptation. They imagined golden cities hidden beyond the dunes, rivers flowing with sweet water, and probably gold dust. While we're at it, and lush oases where magical fountains awaited weary travelers. Spoiler, what actually awaited them were sunstroke, sandstorms, and an impressive selection of venomous reptiles. It's not that no one told them. Locals repeatedly warned them. Stay out of the deep desert, unless you know what you're doing, and you, sir, clearly do not. But European curiosity, combined with the kind of overconfidence that only comes from reading too many adventure novels, kept pushing them forward. If they'd listened to the locals, they could have stayed home, enjoyed a nice cup of tea, and not died in a sandstorm. But no, they had to go discover the world's biggest sandbox. The myths that fueled the madness. What really drew explorers like moths to a flame, or more accurately, like sunburnt moths to a furnace, were the myths. Oh, the glorious, shimmering, completely made-up myths. Stories circulated in European salons and universities of cities of gold, hidden deep in the desert. Places like Timbuktu, which became the poster child for places that probably don't exist the way you think they do. Timbuktu did exist, of course, but it was a center of learning, trade, and culture, not the city made of solid gold that fired up the European imagination. Then there were rumors of mighty rivers crisscrossing the Sahara, just waiting to be claimed, mapped, and probably renamed after some duke's pet spaniel. People genuinely believed that if you could just get over the next dune, you might find the Sahara's version of the Nile. Instead, what they found were more dunes and snakes, and more dunes after that. And let's not forget the magical oases, tales told of lush paradises hidden in the desert, where palm trees swayed over cool, bubbling springs, and fruit dropped from trees into your lap as you lounged in the shade. In reality, these oases existed, but they were tiny, fiercely guarded by those who depended on them. And usually a day's camel ride from the nearest fantasy. Europe's map obsession. Arrogance plus curiosity equal sign disaster. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was in full map-filling mode. The age of exploration had left cartographers with a taste for completeness, and no self-respecting European power wanted blank spots on their maps. Those empty spaces screamed, We don't know what's there, and nothing was more unacceptable to imperial pride. The result? A steady stream of adventurers, soldiers, scientists, and sometimes outright lunatics who set off to conquer the Sahara, armed with fancy compasses, sketchbooks, and absolutely no understanding of what they were getting into. They trudged off into the desert, convinced they would return with fame, fortune, and maybe even a new colony or two for the motherland. What they actually returned with, if they returned at all, was a much greater appreciation for shade. Some expeditions were so poorly planned that failure was inevitable from the first step onto the sand. Men marched off in heavy uniforms, carrying cases of fine china and bottles of wine, but not nearly enough water. Others tried to bring wagons that sank into the dunes within hours, and still others relied on maps made by people who had clearly never seen a grain of sand in their lives. The Sahara was, and remains, a place that demands respect, knowledge, and preparation. For too long, European explorers gave it none of these things, and paid the price. The result? A legacy of heroic-sounding failures, bone-dry cautionary tales, and a lot of sand in places sand should never be. The history of early European attempts to cross the Sahara reads like a manual titled How to Die of Overconfidence in 5 Easy Steps. Picture it, the 17th and 18th centuries, when European explorers, fueled by dreams of glory, gold and maps with fewer blank spaces, packed up their finest umbrellas, their silver pocket watches, and their absolute lack of understanding about deserts, and set off into the largest hot desert on Earth. These were the first fools, brave perhaps, but mostly baffled by what they had signed up for. It all started with a peculiar mix of arrogance and naivety. To these gentlemen adventurers, the Sahara wasn't so much a natural barrier as it was a giant, sun-baked inconvenience standing between them and fame. After all, hadn't they crossed seas, climbed mountains, and charted jungles? How hard could a bit of sand be? As it turned out, very, very hard. The Sahara was not a mild inconvenience. It was an oven large enough to bake the optimism right out of anyone who tried to cross it, without the proper know-how. Their first mistake was assuming that what worked in Europe would work in the desert. Many of these trailblazers marched into the Sahara wearing heavy woolen coats, their trusty pocket watches ticking away in the heat, as if knowing the time would help them find water. Some brought umbrellas, imagining that a spot of shade would be all they needed to keep cool under the murderous sun. Others brought crates of brandy, because hydration is for the unimaginative, apparently, and barrels of wine, as if they were setting up for a picnic, rather than preparing for a battle with heat stroke. The idea of packing actual water, or learning from those who lived in and crossed the desert regularly, seemed to escape them entirely, and so they stumbled forward, their boots filling with sand, their supplies dwindling faster than their pride. One of the most catastrophic misunderstandings was about distance. Maps of the time were more hopeful works of fiction than reliable tools. A journey that looked like a short stroll across a few inches on paper translated to hundreds of miles of grueling terrain in reality. Imagine walking into a furnace that stretches endlessly in all directions, thinking you'll be out the other side by tea time. Now, picture doing it in a wool coat, while sipping brandy to stay strong. That's pretty much what these early expeditions looked like. The Sahara, unimpressed with their determination and ill-suited gear, swallowed many of them whole. Fatal mistakes were the rule rather than the exception. A common error was setting out at the wrong time of day. Instead of traveling at night or during the cooler early morning hours, as desert nomads wisely did, these explorers often marched out under the noon sun, thinking endurance alone would see them through. Spoiler alert, endurance doesn't mean much when you're dehydrated, sunburnt and lost. Navigation was another constant failure. Lacking the experience to read the stars or recognize subtle landmarks, many expeditions wandered in circles, convinced they were making progress until the sandstorm hit or the water ran out. It wasn't just the environment that proved fatal. Relations with local groups were often strained at best. Some explorers assumed their pocket watches and trinkets would impress the Tuareg and Berber guides into loyal service. But what actually impressed the locals was how little these men seemed to know about surviving in the desert. At times, guides abandoned them, either out of frustration or self-preservation, leaving the explorers alone to face the endless dunes, and when supplies ran low, desperation set in. There are stories of men trying to drink camel blood, chew on leather belts, or dig in the sand for moisture that simply wasn't there. The Sahara's silence swallowed their cries, their footprints erased within hours by the shifting winds. Perhaps the most famous example of this early foolishness came in the form of expeditions funded by societies back home that treated the whole affair like a grand adventure rather than a deadly mission. In one case, an explorer brought along cases of fine china and cutlery for dining in style, as if the desert would be impressed by his table manners. Others tried to haul wagons across the dunes, only to find them buried up to the axle in soft sand within a day. And yet, despite all these warnings from nature itself, more expeditions followed, convinced that this time things would be different. It rarely was. In the end, the early European attempts to cross the Sahara stand as a cautionary tale of what happens when confidence outweighs common sense. These explorers might have imagined themselves as heroic pioneers carving paths across the unknown, but the desert didn't care about their intentions. The Sahara tested them, broke them, and more often than not, left them as little more than a forgotten footnote in the history of exploration, or a bleached skeleton beneath the dunes. If you thought the early European explorers' decision to march into the Sahara was bold, wait until you hear about what they packed. Because nothing says ready for desert survival like velvet waistcoats, silver tea services, and crates of claret. It's as if they believed they were heading for a fancy picnic, rather than the world's harshest sandbox. This chapter is a tribute to their, shall we say, creative approach to packing, a logistical circus that turned life-or-death journeys into slapstick farce. Dress like it's a royal ball, in a furnace picture. A man stands at the edge of the Sahara, surveying the dunes stretching endlessly before him. The temperature is hot enough to cook an egg on your hat. So what does he wear? A thick velvet waistcoat, a starched shirt with lace cuffs, and a heavy woolen overcoat. Because fashion waits for no climate. This wasn't just vanity. It was the style of the day. Gentlemen didn't do light and breathable. They did layers, and lots of them. Add to that the red cheeks and dripping brows of men trying to look dignified while their clothes tried to roast them alive. And the boots. Oh, the boots. Sturdy leather creations perfect for muddy English fields, but less suited to sand that reached frying pan temperatures by noon. There are accounts of soles literally melting, or boots so filled with sand that the wearer had to stop every few minutes to dump them out. And headgear, rather than practical wide-brimmed hats, many favoured military-style caps or, better still, tall, feathered creations that turned into sweat sponges within minutes. Sunstroke wasn't so much a risk as a certainty, dining like a duke, while dying of thirst. Let's move on to supplies. A sensible explorer might think water, dried food, medical supplies. Our heroes thought decanters, fine china, monogrammed silver cutlery. There are real reports of expeditions that lugged porcelain dinner sets through the dunes. Because of course, if you're going to collapse from dehydration, at least do so after eating off bone china. Crates of wine and brandy were standard. You'd think they were stocking a Parisian bistro, not facing a weeks-long trek through one of the driest places on earth. These drinks, meant to lift the spirits, did little for hydration, and a lot for accelerating heat exhaustion. But hey, priorities. And then there were the luxury items. Books for evening reading, as if anyone had the strength to lift a volume after a day's march. Folding chairs which usually sank into the sand, and delicate writing desks. One group even tried to bring along a collapsible bathtub. The Sahara was not impressed. The vehicles that sank before they started. Some expeditions believed they could outsmart the desert with technology. Enter the wagons and carts. Wagons worked fine on the grassy plains of Europe, but in the Sahara, the wheels sank into soft sand within hours, turning expensive carriages into expensive deadweight. There are hilarious and tragic tales of teams spending days trying to dig out wagons, only for them to sink again the moment they moved a few feet. Even camels, the true ships of the desert, were sometimes overloaded with ridiculous items. There's something both comical and pitiful about a poor beast of burden staggering under a load of wine barrels and ornamental furniture while its rider wonders where all the water went. Tents were another disaster. Imported canvas models, designed for the gentle breezes of European meadows, stood no chance against Sahara winds. They blew away, shredded into ribbons by sand-laden gusts that could strip skin. What remained offered little shade and less comfort. Logistics from bad to fiasco. Packing mistakes were compounded by poor planning. Many expeditions underestimated how much food and water they'd need, or overestimated how much they could carry. It wasn't uncommon for supplies to run out days or weeks before the next known oasis. And when you're left with brandy and fine china but no water or bread, the desert tends to win. The lack of proper navigation tools added to the farce. Some expeditions set off without a reliable compass, or with maps that were little better than artistic doodles. Instead of charting precise routes, explorers often wandered, dragging their piles of unnecessary belongings behind them like tragicomic caravans of excess. Fatal packing like forgetting sunscreen. But deadly all in all, the gear choices of these Sahara expeditions were the kind of mistake that would get you laughed off a modern hiking trail. It's like packing for a beach trip and forgetting the sunscreen, but fatal. The mismatch between what was brought and what was needed turned many an expedition into a cautionary tale of hubris. The Sahara punished these errors swiftly and harshly, so the next time you pack too many snacks for a short trip, remember, at least you didn't bring a silver tea service into the Sahara. As early European explorers stumbled into the Sahara, sunburnt, parched, and dragging carts full of useless silverware, they often found themselves face to face with people who actually knew how to survive there. The Tuareg, Berber, and Arab nomads. These desert dwellers were the true masters of the Sahara, navigating its endless sands with a casual confidence that made the Europeans look like lost puppies in fancy coats. The Tuareg, Berbers, and Arab guides. The real MVPs. Imagine being a Tuareg warrior or a Berber guide and seeing a group of red-faced, wool-clad strangers dragging broken wagons across the dunes. You can almost hear the internal sigh. The locals had centuries of experience reading the desert's subtle signs. A shift in the wind, a faint trail left by a caravan, the angle of the stars. They could find hidden wells where outsiders saw only dust. They knew where to camp, when to travel. Hint, not at noon, and how to avoid becoming a snack for the desert. For many European expeditions, hiring local guides wasn't just helpful. It was the only thing standing between them and becoming permanent additions to the Sahara's skeleton collection. Tuareg and Berber guides led lost explorers back to safety, shared precious water, and taught them the basics of survival. Wrap your head to block the sun, travel by night, respect the land, and please, ditch the velvet coat. But here's the fun twist. These locals were not only skilled navigators, they were also skilled negotiators. The art of the desert deal. You see, the Sahara didn't just breed survival experts, it bred expert businessmen. The guides knew they were indispensable, and they charged accordingly. Some expeditions found their rescue came at a price. Need water? That'll cost you. A camel to replace the one that collapsed under your crate of silver goblets? Hope you brought treasure, and who could blame them? The explorers were often clueless, rich, and desperate. The holy trinity of good business opportunities. There are accounts of guides doubling or tripling their prices as the desert's challenges mounted. One Tuareg leader famously charged an explorer not just for water but for showing him where to dig for it. A lesson in desert capitalism. If ever there was one, occasionally guides would simply abandon expeditions that ignored their advice. Why stick around when your employer insists on marching into a sandstorm at midday? Better to leave the fools to their fate and move on with your life. Rich cultures, richly ignored. It's easy to focus on how the locals saved or outsmarted the explorers, but what's often forgotten is how much the Europeans missed out on by refusing to respect or understand desert cultures. The Tuareg, Berber, and Arab peoples had rich traditions of music, poetry, craftsmanship, and storytelling, as well as complex social systems and codes of honor. But too many explorers, blinded by their mission to plant flags and draw maps, treated these cultures as obstacles or curiosities rather than sources of wisdom. Instead of learning from nomads about sustainable living in the harshest of environments, the delicate balance between people, animals, and scarce resources, many explorers saw only exotic others. This attitude not only cost them valuable knowledge, but in some cases their lives. The Sahara is not a place that forgives arrogance easily. What real survival looked like to the desert nomads. Survival wasn't about luck or brute strength. It was about knowledge passed down through generations. It meant traveling with lean, resilient camels rather than overloaded wagons. It meant wearing loose, light robes that shielded from sun and sand, not woolen uniforms, better suited for European winters. It meant moving like the desert itself, patient, adaptable, aware of every sound and shadow. Water was life, and knowing where to find it was as valuable as gold. Food was simple, portable, nourishing. Navigation wasn't done with pocket watches or fanciful maps. It was done with the stars, the wind, and the lay of the land. And let's not forget, it meant avoiding unnecessary risks. No random wandering into unknown dunes for the sake of exploration. The nomads knew that in the Sahara, bravado gets you killed, the lost puppies of the desert. The contrast between these seasoned desert peoples and the bumbling European explorers could not have been starker. Picture it. On one side, the locals, calm and competent, gliding across the sand like they owned it. On the other, the explorers, sweaty, confused, with sunburns in places they didn't know could burn, dragging their collapsing wagons, arguing over the last drops of brandy, and wondering where they went wrong. As one might put it, the locals were masters of survival. The Europeans were sunburnt lost puppies, yelping at the dunes. If you're going to cross the Sahara, you need camels, not want. Need. Because without them, your grand expedition would end about as successfully as a snowball in the midday dunes. Camels weren't just beasts of burden. They were the difference between life and death. But oh, did they come with attitude. In fact, if camels could talk, you'd imagine every sentence would begin with, "Seriously, this is your plan." Let's meet the animal that powered Sahara exploration, and probably judged the explorers harder than the sun ever did. Camels are marvels of natural engineering, so perfectly adapted to desert life they might as well have been designed by the Sahara itself. Need a vehicle that can carry heavy loads over endless sand? Check. Need one that can go over a week without water? Double check. Need one that won't collapse at the first whiff of heat? Triple check. Early explorers quickly learned that their wagons, horses, and mules were about as useful in the Sahara as a chocolate teapot. Camels, by contrast, glided across the dunes like ships at sea. Their wide, leathery feet worked like natural snowshoes, keeping them from sinking. Their humps, contrary to popular belief, didn't store water but fat, providing vital energy reserves when food was scarce. A well-trained camel could carry up to 600 pounds of cargo. Water, food, tents, crates of unnecessary luxury goods. Camels bore it all with a grumpy, slow-plodding grace. They didn't move fast, but they moved steady. And in the Sahara, steady wins the race. If nature gave the camel superpowers for survival, it balanced this generosity by making sure camels had personalities to match. And by personalities we mean they were experts at passive-aggressive protest. Camels didn't just carry loads, they commented on it, through groans, grumbles, and dramatic glares that said, "Really? Another crate of silver spoons? What about water?" Many European explorers, used to obedient horses, found camels maddening. Camels didn't care for their masters' titles, uniforms, or fancy hats. They obeyed when they felt like it. And when they didn't, well, good luck. They could sit down and refuse to budge, no matter how much coaxing, cursing, or cajoling came their way. Some expeditions recorded losing entire days because their camels went on what could only be described as a strike. And don't get explorers started on the spitting. Camels didn't just spit, they launched precise, gooey missiles of disgust. If an explorer annoyed his camel, and let's face it, they usually did, he risked getting a face full of chewed cud. It was the camel's way of saying, "This partnership is not going well." Then there were the stampedes. One frightened camel could trigger panic in the entire herd, setting off a chain reaction of chaos that left men diving for cover. Imagine a dozen or more camels charging across the dunes, gear flying, crates smashing, and explorers yelling as their supplies disappeared over the horizon. One recorded incident involved an entire load of valuable trade goods vanishing in a single, furious gallop, all because a startled camel took exception to a flapping tent. The explorer in charge could do nothing but watch his fortune sprint away into the sunset. Even when they weren't stampeding, camels could make progress tortuously slow. A stubborn camel could decide to kneel down mid-journey and simply stay there. No amount of pulling on reins or shouting in multiple languages could convince it otherwise. The locals, of course, watched all this with quiet amusement, knowing that camels did what camels wanted, and no amount of European bluster would change that. Camels were also great equalizers. It didn't matter if you were a baron or a peasant. To a camel, you were just another annoying human demanding too much. Fancy hat, expensive boots, the camel didn't care. It would spit at you just as readily as at your servant. And let's talk about the saddle sores. Riding a camel wasn't the smooth, dignified affair many newcomers imagined. Instead, it was a bone-jarring, chafing, swaying ordeal that left even the toughest explorer walking funny after a day in the saddle. If the Sahara didn't humble you, the camel's gait would. In the end, the camel was both savior and tormentor. It made expeditions possible, but not easy. Explorers might have dreamed of conquering the Sahara, but they soon realized they weren't in charge. The real boss, the camel, proof that nature invented sarcasm in animal form. By now, our brave European explorers, sunburnt and saddle-sore from their run-ins with camels, were ready to face what they thought was the Sahara's biggest challenge, the heat. Oh, the sweet, innocent optimism. Because as brutal as the sun was, it was just one item on the Sahara's long list of creative ways to end an expedition. The desert didn't stop at making you sweat buckets. It threw sandstorms, venomous creatures, and cruel tricks of the light at you, just to keep things interesting. Let's start with the sandstorms. To the untrained eye, the desert might look like a still, endless sea of sand, but that sea could turn on you in an instant. One moment, the horizon's clear, the next, the wind picks up, and before you can say, "Where's my hat?" you're being pelted by sand with the force of 1,000 tiny fists. Sand got everywhere. And yes, I mean everywhere. Inside boots, under armor, in food, in water supplies, between your teeth, up your nose. It clogged weapons, jammed compasses, and turned carefully drawn maps into abstract art. More than one expedition disappeared entirely under the dunes, swallowed up, and lost for good. Imagine pitching your fancy European tent, only to wake up to find it, and your supplies buried under a miniature mountain. There was no dignity in a sandstorm, only a lot of coughing, cursing, and frantic digging. But just when you thought the wind had finished having its fun, the Sahara had more surprises slithering beneath the sands. The desert was home to snakes so well camouflaged you'd only notice them when it was too late, usually right as they sank their fangs into your ankle. The good news, the snake that bit you probably died of heat stroke too. The bad news, you'd be lucky to last much longer yourself without proper treatment, which, in the middle of nowhere, was usually limited to panicked shouting and ineffective folk remedies. Then there were the scorpions, scuttling into boots at night or hiding in bedding, ready to deliver a sting that could ruin your week or your life. And because no nightmare is complete without buzzing accompaniment, the Sahara's mosquitoes swarmed at dusk, carrying diseases and sheer annoyance in equal measure. They didn't just bite, they feasted, making explorers question if their blood was part of the ecosystem's food chain. And if that wasn't enough, the desert liked to mess with your mind. Starvation and dehydration were the constant background threats, with water supplies running low far faster than even the most careful planners expected. The sun baked the land so thoroughly that even the hardiest explorers began seeing things, shimmering lakes where none existed, waving palms that vanished as you approached, villages that melted into thin air. These weren't gentle, harmless illusions. They were cruel jokes played by the heat and exhaustion. More than one expedition veered miles off course chasing a mirage, only to find themselves deeper in danger. There's nothing quite as humbling as realizing you've marched a full day toward what you thought was salvation, only to end up standing in yet more sand, hungrier, thirstier, and ready to throw your compass off the nearest dune. Of course, you'd think the smart move would be to stay put during the worst of the heat, maybe wait for cooler times of day to travel. But the Sahara didn't play by polite rules. Nights brought their own hazards, biting cold that turned sunburned skin numb, predators that prowled the dark, and shifting dunes that erased the trail you'd made just hours before. You could go to sleep certain of your direction and wake up unsure which way was north. The desert was an artist of confusion, and its canvas was your sense of security. What made all these dangers worse was the simple fact that no one could really prepare for them. You could bring the best gear Europe had to offer, rifles, tents, medical kits, and the Sahara would laugh in your face, or at least as much as a desert can laugh. Guns jammed with sand, tents tore in the gales, and medicine ran out before it could do any good. The only real defense against the Sahara's hazards was experience, and as we've seen, many European explorers had precious little of that. By the time an expedition made it through these trials, if it did at all, it was often a much humbler, much dustier, and much thinner group of men that stumbled out the other side. The Sahara didn't just test your endurance, it stripped away illusions, pride, and sometimes entire expeditions. In the grand game of survival, the desert always seemed to hold the better hand, dealing out surprises that even the bravest couldn't predict. If optimism had a graveyard, it would be the Sahara, and carved on the tombstones would be the names of explorers who set out with grand ambitions and ended up as cautionary tales. Because while the Sahara's heat, sandstorms and camels were formidable, nothing quite compares to the drama, disaster, and dark comedy of some of the desert's most infamous expeditions. Let's begin with Major Alexander Gordon Laing, the man who could probably have walked through a cactus patch and said, "It builds character." Laing was a Scottish explorer whose mission in the 1820s was to become the first European to reach Timbuktu, the city of legend, the supposed El Dorado of Africa. Laing's journey began with the usual mix of bravado and terrible planning. Imagine loading up your camel caravan, knowing full well that almost every European before you had disappeared or died trying. But Laing was undeterred. He marched straight into the desert like he was off for a pleasant hike. What followed could have been a dark comedy if it hadn't been so tragic. Laing was attacked by Tuareg raiders, who didn't particularly appreciate uninvited guests. They stabbed him multiple times, shattered his arm, and left him half dead in the sand. Most men would have called it a day, crawled home, or at least taken a break. Laing? He kept going. He wrapped his wounds, mounted his camel, and pressed on. Because apparently even near-fatal injuries weren't going to stop him from seeing Timbuktu. Against all odds, he made it. He limped into the city, bloodied, exhausted, and probably smelling like every terrible thing in the desert combined. And here's the punchline. After all that, he barely had time to glimpse Timbuktu's famed mud brick architecture before being murdered on his way out. His journals, which might have described his remarkable journey in detail, conveniently vanished. The desert didn't just take explorers' lives, it took their stories too. Then, there's the spectacular disaster that was the Richardson, Overweg, and Bath expedition. This trio of adventurers, if you can call them that, set off in 1850, sent by the British government to chart unknown regions, open up trade routes, and generally wave the Imperial flag where no European had waved it before. Richardson was the religious one, sent partly to spread civilization rid, British values and moral superiority across the sands. Overweg was the scientist, eager to catalogue rocks, fossils, and anything else that wouldn't kill him first. And Bath was the nerdy, detail-obsessed linguist, interested in cultures, languages, and keeping a diary so precise that he made modern Instagram food bloggers look casual. From the start, their trip read like a script for a tragicomic play. Richardson died of disease not long into the journey, leaving behind a journal that mainly detailed his increasing sense of doom. Overweg, plucky but naive, managed to drown, yes, drown, in the middle of Africa. Who knew you could die of water on a continent? Everyone else was dying of thirst on. That left Bath, who somehow survived multiple assassination attempts, desertion by his guides, starvation and severe sunstroke, all while writing everything down in painstaking detail. Bath was the last man standing, limping back to Europe, looking like a ghost who'd lost a fight with a sandstorm. His reward? A mixture of fame, pity, and the haunting realization that his imperial sponsors were mainly disappointed. He hadn't brought back more trade deals or gold. What unites these expeditions, beyond the absurdity of their misfortunes, is how imperial hubris collided with brutal reality. These men ventured into the Sahara, not because it made sense, but because the maps had blank spots, and those blank spots were just too tempting for empires hungry for glory, trade, and bragging rights. The result? A parade of half-prepared, overconfident adventurers who left their bones and broken dreams scattered across the dunes. Let's not forget the lesser-known adventurers who believed they could tame the desert with newfangled inventions. One French explorer attempted to cross part of the Sahara using a steam-powered cart, as if the desert wouldn't notice or mind a clanking, smoking contraption chugging across its sacred sands. The cart broke down almost immediately, stranded its operator, and probably left local nomads with a hilarious story to tell for generations. In the end, exploring the Sahara was less about finding riches or fame, and more about surviving long enough to tell the tale. The desert didn't care for imperial ambition or scientific curiosity. It simply tested every human who dared step onto its sands, and more often than not, it won, exploring the Sahara where optimism went to die, and the desert always got the last laugh. If you thought the Sahara's heat, snakes, and sandstorms were the greatest threat to European explorers, think again. The deadliest weapon of all, bad maps. Yes, fragile scraps of parchment, adorned with squiggly rivers, imaginary cities, and confident labels like Lake of Gold, or Here Be Sand. In the grand tradition of fake it till you make it, many explorers set off, armed with maps that were as accurate as a pirate's treasure chart, drawn by a tipsy parrot. Let's talk about the Niger River, or rather, the endless, frustrating, and occasionally hilarious quest to figure out where on earth it went. European geographers were convinced that the Niger was a massive water highway, probably linking up with the Nile, or maybe the Congo, or possibly the Amazon, if you squinted hard enough. No one knew for sure, but they all agreed on one thing: the Niger had to go somewhere important. It just had to. This belief sparked generations of explorers marching off into the Sahara with grand dreams of charting the Niger's path. Picture it: sunburned, exhausted men dragging their compasses and waterskins across endless dunes, chasing rivers that, according to their maps, were just over the next ridge, only to find, surprise, more sand. More than one expedition wandered hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, convinced they were on the brink of discovering a mighty waterway, only to realize too late they'd been following mirages, camel tracks, or their own footprints in a big, depressing circle. The obsession with finding the Niger's mouth led to some truly spectacular miscalculations. Some maps confidently showed the river pouring into the Atlantic at various spots along West Africa. Others had it looping like a demented spaghetti noodle through the desert before vanishing underground, or possibly into thin air. These cartographic guesses weren't just harmless doodles, they got people killed. Expeditions planned their routes based on rivers that didn't exist. They packed provisions expecting to refill water supplies at mythical lakes that turned out to be sun-baked salt pans. And when reality didn't match the map, well, that was obviously reality's fault. And the Niger wasn't the only phantom feature to inspire bad decisions. Entire cities appeared on maps thanks to hearsay, wishful thinking, or the 17th century equivalent of my cousin's friend swears he saw it. Timbuktu, for instance, was drawn as a golden metropolis, bigger than Paris, filled with treasures beyond imagining. While Timbuktu was indeed real, the treasure part was a bit of an exaggeration. But once it appeared on the map with a giant gold icon next to it, you'd better believe expeditions were launched purely to go claim the riches that turned out to be, well, mostly mud bricks and scholarly manuscripts. Valuable, yes, but not quite the overflowing vaults of gold everyone expected. Then there were the lakes. Oh, the lakes. Lake Chad, Lake unpronounceable, all mapped in wildly different places, sizes, and shapes, depending on who you asked. Some maps even featured entirely imaginary lakes with confident names like Lake of the Moon. Spoiler, no moon, no lake. These fictional water features led countless explorers to trudge through unforgiving terrain, convinced they were about to stumble upon a fresh water source, only to find their boots full of sand and their hopes dashed. And let's not forget the classic cartographer's move: when in doubt, label a blank patch desert or Here Be Sand. This wasn't a warning so much as a shrug. It was as if the mapmaker was saying, "We have no idea what's here. Proceed at your own risk. Good luck." Explorers, naturally, saw these blank spots not as dangers to avoid, but as opportunities to make their names, or meet their doom. The consequences of trusting bad maps were grim. Expeditions ran out of supplies miles from any real water source. Men died chasing illusions, their skeletons becoming part of the landscape they'd so desperately tried to chart. Meanwhile, back in Europe, mapmakers kept adding and erasing features with the confidence of artists working in crayon. Each new expedition brought back corrections, or just more wild guesses, to be inked onto the next edition of the map. But let's give those old cartographers some credit. They worked with what they had: rumours, scraps of explorer journals, and the occasional inaccurate sketch by someone half-blinded by sandstorms. It wasn't easy piecing together a puzzle when half the pieces were missing, and the other half were drawn by people who thought camels were horses with humps. So next time you look at a map and marvel at its precision, spare a thought for the brave, or perhaps foolhardy, souls who once set off across the Sahara, guided by lines and dots that were about as trustworthy as a mirage at noon. Lesson learned. If your map says, "Here be sand," maybe don't go there. If you thought explorers ventured into the Sahara driven solely by curiosity, passion for discovery, or a death wish, think again. Behind every sunburned European staggering across the dunes, there stood an empire, watching, funding, and quietly sharpening its knives. Because as much as the Sahara was about survival, it was also about imperial ambition, glory for the few, gold for the privileged, and geopolitics for the mapmakers and monarchs, who were frankly much too comfortable back home. Let's be clear. For the great European powers of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Sahara wasn't just a desert. It was a giant, sandy chessboard. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, they all gazed at those blank spots on the map and saw opportunity, trade routes, mineral wealth, strategic advantage, all just waiting to be claimed, or so they believed, despite all evidence that the desert wasn't about to roll out a red carpet and offer up its secrets. Explorers like René Caillié, Mungo Park, or Alexander Laing weren't merely plucky adventurers. They were, whether they liked it or not, pawns in their nation's high-stakes imperial games. Their orders might have said explore or map, but the fine print read, find us something to exploit. Whether it was gold, salt, slaves, or simply new territory to plant a flag on, European empires were eager to turn sand into profit. Consider France's obsession with West Africa. French authorities poured funds into expeditions, not out of love for the desert's stark beauty, but to gain control over trade routes linking the interior of Africa to coastal ports. The Sahara became the inconvenient barrier between European merchants and the riches of sub-Saharan Africa. So what did France do? It tried, repeatedly, to punch through that barrier with caravans of explorers, soldiers, and eventually, railways. The idea? If we can't charm the desert, maybe we can outbuild it. Spoiler, the Sahara was unimpressed. Britain, meanwhile, played its own imperial game, fixated on controlling the flow of goods. And let's be honest, people from Central Africa, the British government sent expeditions that doubled as reconnaissance missions. The official line was always something noble, opening up commerce, bringing civilization, spreading knowledge. The unofficial reality, they were also looking for ways to outmaneuver the French, Portuguese, or whoever else dared set foot in their sand. And oh, the sweet irony. These empires invested enormous resources, sent their best and brightest, or at least their boldest, and endured staggering losses. Also that some politician back home could add a wavy line to a map, or brag about newly opened markets. Imagine risking your life to cross 1,000 miles of blistering heat, venomous snakes, and hostile terrain so that Lord So-and-so could sip tea and boast about his empire's newly acquired influence. Truly, nothing screams geopolitical genius like losing half your expedition to dehydration, so someone in London can enjoy cheaper sugar. The desert, for its part, played the role of reluctant host to these imperial ambitions. Sure, European powers managed to plant their flags, sign treaties, and build a few outposts, but at a cost so steep, even their accountants probably wept. The Sahara swallowed men, fortunes, and dreams without a second thought. It didn't care about national borders, trade monopolies, or the color of your flag. In the end, the desert won far more battles than any European army did. Yet the imperial powers clung to their Sahara ambitions. Why? Partly because geopolitics is fueled by fear. If Britain didn't control a trade route, what if France did? If France didn't annex a patch of sand, what if Spain claimed it first? The scramble for empire was as much about denying your rivals as it was about enriching yourself. The Sahara was, in many ways, the world's largest and most exhausting game of I saw it first. Of course, the real cost wasn't just gold or lost explorers. The relentless push to conquer, control, and carve up the desert left deep scars on the indigenous peoples who actually knew how to survive there. Nomadic tribes found their lands divided, their trade routes taxed or blocked, and their autonomy stripped away in the name of empire. The Sahara became not just a natural barrier, but a man-made one, crisscrossed by colonial ambitions and bristling with resentment. So next time you hear about those brave explorers and visionary imperialists who crossed the Sahara, remember this: behind every heroic tale was a ledger, and behind every map was a plan to turn the desert's silence into someone else's profit. The Sahara, where explorers risked death, empires gambled fortunes, and the only one who always came out ahead was the sand. After centuries of daring or foolhardy expeditions across the Sahara, what did these explorers really leave behind? Besides, of course, a lot of sun-bleached bones, rusted gear, and confused camels. The legacy of their desert adventures is a strange blend of scientific breakthroughs, map improvements, half-true legends, and let's be honest, a fair bit of litter still buried beneath the dunes. Let's start with the good knowledge. For all their blunders, many explorers did manage to bring back useful information. They helped fill in the terrifyingly large blanks on maps of Africa. Thanks to their grueling efforts, Europe learned the real courses of rivers, like the Niger, the locations of trade hubs like Timbuktu. Surprise, fewer golden rooftops than the rumors promised, and the staggering size and harshness of the Sahara itself. The idea of Africa as a blank space, filled with mystery and monsters, slowly gave way to a more accurate, if still imperfect, understanding. Geography, botany, meteorology, and anthropology all gained from their notes, sketches, and sand-crusted specimens. They also helped bust some myths while creating new ones. The Sahara wasn't just a deadly wasteland, though yes, it could kill you quicker than you could say. Where's the water? It was home to complex cultures, trade networks, and resilient people who thrived where Europeans barely survived. Of course, many explorers didn't focus on that part. They preferred to paint the desert as a vast, empty stage for their heroics, which led to the romanticized, Hollywood-style version of the Sahara that still lingers today. You know, the one: endless dunes, lost cities, treasure, and maybe a cursed mummy or two. And then there's the stuff they literally left behind. The Sahara is a graveyard of expedition debris. Somewhere under the sand lie the remains of wagons, water barrels, rusted rifles, shattered sextants, and the occasional unlucky adventurer. Many expeditions disappeared so thoroughly that modern searchers occasionally stumble across relics, tattered journals, a sun-baked shoe, the skeletal outline of a camp, that whisper of grand ambitions gone horribly wrong. Some wreckage tells a silent story of desperation, the discarded gear of men who realized too late that every extra pound might mean the difference between life and death. You can almost picture it. Someone flinging aside a heavy telescope, cursing the fool who thought it would be useful to stare at more sand, or a water barrel cracked and empty, abandoned after its last precious drops were drunk or lost to a leak. And yet, despite the broken dreams scattered across the desert, the Sahara still draws adventurers. Sure, today's explorers have GPS, satellite phones, water filters, and at least a passing acquaintance with the concept of common sense most of the time. But the desert's mystique remains. People still want to cross it, chart it, photograph it, or just test themselves against its brutal vastness. From scientific expeditions to thrill seekers on dune buggies, the Sahara keeps calling. What is it about the place that's so irresistible? Maybe it's the challenge, maybe it's the beauty, because for all its dangers, the Sahara is breathtaking, in that minimalist, don't blink or you'll miss it kind of way. Maybe it's the legends of lost cities, buried treasure, or the romance of following in the footsteps of those who dared and often didn't make it. But here's the final lesson the Sahara teaches: respect the desert. The explorers who succeeded weren't always the boldest or the bravest. They were the ones who listened, adapted, and learned from the people who lived there. The Sahara isn't something to be conquered, it's something to survive, to study, and if you're lucky, to cross without joining the ranks of those who left their bones behind. So the next time you see a sleek documentary crew setting out with modern gear and confident smiles, remember the desert has seen it all before, and the sand keeps its secrets. The good news: today's adventurers have better maps and better gear. The bad news: the Sahara's still bigger, older, and tougher than all of them.